The Subcommittee on Aviation will come to order. I ask unanimous consent that the chairman be authorized to declare a recess at any time during today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that the members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions. Without objection, so ordered. And as a reminder, if members wish to insert a document into the record, please also email it to documentsti@mail.house.gov. I now recognize myself for the purpose of an opening statement for 5 minutes. Good morning. Thank you to our panel of witnesses for being here today. You each have a unique perspective on today's discussion, the current state of our nation's airports. 3,200 airports, ranging from large hub commercial service airports to small and general aviation airports, 3,200 of them in our great country. Beyond facilitating the safe and efficient transportation of millions of passengers per year, airports connect our communities and drive economic development in major cities and small towns across America. Last year, airports experienced over 987 million passenger enplanements and supported 101 million aircraft operations. Passenger enplanements are only expected to grow, with industry reports forecasting nearly 1 billion in 2025, raising to 1.4 billion by 2040. In order to address the infrastructure needs to meet the growing demand of air travel, industry estimates conclude the United States airports will require almost $174 billion in infrastructure investments over the next 5 years. Federal investment in our nation's commercial service and general aviation airport infrastructure is vital to ensuring the safety and economic success of the aviation industry. Far too long, funding for the primary federal airport capital program, the Airport Improvement Program, which is AIP, remains stagnant, while increasing program administrative burdens and growing airport infrastructure needs reduced the program's effectiveness. That's why this committee included robust funding and reforms for airport projects in the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2024. Specifically, the FAA bill increased AIP funding to $4 billion annually, added flexibility to the use of the AIP funds, contained comprehensive environmental streamlining reform to expand the number of projects categorically excluded from NEPA reviews, and cut bureaucratic red tape to expedite project deliveries. Now we must work to ensure that these provisions are implemented on time and the way that Congress intended. As the subcommittee continues oversight, hearings such as today's offer a great opportunity to discuss ongoing airport infrastructure needs and how Congress can promote regulatory stability that is crucial in allowing airports to properly plan and invest in capital improvement projects. Additionally, as we work with President Trump and Secretary Duffy on the administration's vision to modernize our national airspace system, it is very important to discuss airfield and surface safety needs as a part of such effort. With that, I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here today. I look forward to hearing your testimony. I will now recognize Ranking Member Cohen for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for our witnesses for being here. In preparation for this meeting, I met with some of our staff yesterday, and I tried to explain to them who Pete Rose was. One of them didn't know who Pete Rose was, but I guess he's not for him getting in the Hall of Fame, and I didn't want to talk about Duke. But they did know about the airports. They briefed me well on that, and our airports are so important for our country, for people getting around, economics, jobs. And airports do that. They connect communities, they connect people, they fuel our economies, and they support our broader transportation ecosystem that works together with the airplanes. As ranking member, I've been proud to support transformative investments in critical facilities to airports, especially the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the 2024 FAA Reauthorization Act. That was one of the more important bills we passed last year. Ranking member, as ranking member, I was proud to participate with, at that time, Chairman Graves, and of course, our ranking member Larson, and Chairman Graves, who did such a great job in putting the bill together. Hopefully all those geniuses from DOGE won't tear it apart and destroy it. The IJA in particular made historic investments in our airport in Memphis, including airports all over the country. In Memphis, we've seen the firsthand impact. The Memphis International Airport, the busiest cargo airport in North America and the second busiest in the world prior to tariffs, has leveraged this funding and grants to make meaningful improvements for cargo and passengers alike. Of course, Memphis is home to FedEx, and that's why we're so high in the cargo area. The airport's newly modernized terminals, consolidated operations, enhanced accessibility, and significantly improved energy efficiency. It's more than just a facelift. This is the next generation facility that reflects Memphis's role as a logistics leader and gateway to the world. In 2024, the FAA reauthorization bill that continued our momentum and authorized $4 billion annually through 2028 for the Airport Improvement Program, which was the first substantial increase in over a decade. But challenges still remain. The FAA estimates $67.5 billion in needed airport infrastructure upgrades through 2029. Terminals are aging. Gate capacity is strained, and with the expected rise of advanced air mobility aircraft and growing climate risks, our airports must be equipped not just for today, but for tomorrow. That means continued investment in safety, which remains top of mind after recent accidents and close calls. The Runway Safety Council and the new FAA initiatives to improve surface surveillance and detection systems are critical, and will continue working to ensure their effective implementation. It means ensuring workers have the support, training, and protections they need to do their jobs safely. Ramp operators, people working on the ramp, and people, the air traffic controllers as well. We've tragically lost at least 5 ramp workers in just the past 2.5 years. These workers are operating in fast-moving, extreme environments, included on the tarmac and the elements, guiding aircraft, loading bags, and supporting passengers with disabilities. And yet the FAA-mandated ramp safety review required by FAA reauthorization is months overdue. We cannot allow this kind of delay when lives are on the line. Likewise, gate and ticket agents are facing a rise in verbal and physical assaults, often from simply enforcing airline policy. I don't remember that happening in the past. It may have, but I don't remember people being rowdy on airplanes and having to be held down and all that. So somewhere or another, society is getting a little bit out of hand. The FAA law included new protections for frontline workers, but they must be implemented swiftly and with labor's voice at the table. And for passengers with disabilities, which is an issue I'm championing in that bill, we've taken long overdue steps to ensure their mobility devices are properly handled. Wheelchairs were thrown around and destroyed, and those are people's legs. An issue that I was proud to work with Senator Duckworth, who championed the issue as well. The Department of Transportation's new rule on training for stowing wheelchairs and scooters is now finalized, and it's vital that airlines act quickly and responsibly to implement it. In Memphis and across the country, airports are economic engines and community anchors. Let's make sure we give them the tools and investments and workforce protections they need to succeed. Thank you, and I look forward to today's discussion and hearing from you all and what's going on in Cincinnati and Raleigh-Durham. Yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Ranking Member of the full committee, Mr. Larson. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Nels and Ranking Member Cohen, for holding today's hearing to examine our airport infrastructure, the safety and regulatory challenges they face, and to find ways to address these challenges. I want to, as well, thank the witnesses for joining us today. Airports serve as a vital engines that power local economies. They generate good jobs, they stimulate local businesses, and they attract financial investment. A study published by the Airports Council International North America last month found that airports with commercial service support 12.8 million jobs, provide $619 billion in annual payroll, and produce $1.8 trillion of annual output. Even more than those benefits, airports serve as a critical, of course, transportation hub and strengthen connectivity by bringing people together safely. Congress recognized the importance of airports when we passed the 2024 FAA reauthorization. That law bolsters airport infrastructure and operations, improves environmental protections, and most importantly, enhances airport safety. The safety provisions included requirements to maximize the hiring of air traffic controllers, expand the deployment of surface surveillance technology to prevent near misses at all large and medium airports, create a new runway safety grant program, accelerate the replacement of insufficient air traffic control legacy systems, and strengthen protections for airport workers, among other reforms. As we approach the one-year anniversary of the law's passage, it's become more important than ever that FAA is fully staffed and resourced to implement these key provisions as quickly as possible. Conducting indiscriminate and reckless layoffs of safety personnel goes in the wrong direction. Instead, we have to recommit ourselves to make our national airspace system, or the NAS, safer, more innovative, and efficient. As the last few months have shown, we can no longer afford to wait. For instance, on January 29th, our nation experienced one of the worst aviation accidents in recent history. That evening, a U.S. Army Black Hawk helicopter crashed in an American Airlines flight. It was Flight 5342 near Washington National Airport, or DCA, tragically claiming the lives of all 67 people on board both aircraft. It was the first major U.S. commercial passenger flight to crash in nearly 16 years and marked the end of one of the longest streaks without such a crash in U.S. history. And while the victims' families and the nation continue to grieve this immense loss, this tragic accident was unfortunately followed by a series of other safety incidents in Alaska, Philadelphia, Arizona, and several other places. In addition, there has been a series of troubling near-miss events at DCA. Now, the data shows that aviation remains the safest mode of travel in the U.S. However, the recent series of accidents has shaken the confidence of the traveling public. Passengers deserve to board their flights and safely reach their destinations without incident and without worry. In order to restore this confidence, Congress, the administration, and industry must take decisive actions to make the system safer. I'm pleased that the FAA is implementing the National Transportation Safety Board's recommendations, immediate recommendations, in response to the DCA mid-air collision and other accidents that will make the airspace safer. For instance, the FAA has swiftly banned most non-essential helicopter operations near DCA, is reviewing 21 U.S. airports to determine whether there are any safety risks similar to those at DCA, and is requiring federal agencies that conduct aircraft operations near DCA to broadcast their position using ADS-B out. While I applaud these actions, there's more that needs to be done, and recent incidents show the U.S. aviation system continues to be under stress. A 2024 GAO report highlights the critical need to replace our aging air traffic control systems, with over a third of these systems described as unsustainable, and another 40% as being potentially unsustainable. That's why I, as well as many of us, are looking forward to Secretary Duffy's proposal to replace and modernize these systems. Whether it is this proposal, the decisions to streamline the air traffic control hiring process, or the FAA's recent policy changes to protect flights in and around DCA, I will support in any and all actions that make our system safer. What I won't support is getting bogged down in partisan witch hunts or implementing mass layoffs or otherwise undermining the FAA's workforce. Those actions don't make our system safer. There's no place for some of the baseless rhetoric we've heard about the air traffic personnel. We need to have constructive conversations on how to improve aviation safety. And I'm hopeful that the Secretary Duffy and the FAA leadership will understand these pressing challenges facing U.S. aviation and focus their time and energy on where it belongs, on strengthening the safety of the NAS. So what can we do to make airports and the national airspace safer? For one, we must prioritize our authority to conduct critical oversight. Second, we need to, the Congress and administration have to work together to consider bipartisan proposals to strengthen the air traffic control system. Next, this committee needs to take a serious look at the final NTSB recommendations once they're published next year and be prepared to swiftly adopt these should they be, so they can be implemented. And finally, the committee should continue to listen to what key stakeholders, such as the witnesses before us today, have to say about how to increase safety. When we're working together, we can produce long-lasting safety reforms needed to ensure a safer, a more innovative, and efficient NAS. And I look forward today to hear from the witnesses.
The gentleman yields. I would now like to welcome our witnesses and thank them again for being here today. Briefly, I'll take a moment to explain our lighting system to our witnesses. Lights are in front of you. Green means go. Yellow, you're running out of town. Red, pump the brakes, right? I ask unanimous consent that the witnesses' full statements be included into the record. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. Without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included into the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. As your written testimony has been made part of the record, the subcommittee asks that you limit your oral remarks to the 5 minutes I'd like now to briefly recognize Representative Foshee to provide a quick introduction of our first witness, Mr. Landguth. Ms. Foshee, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Indeed, I am very pleased to introduce one of our witnesses today from my home state, Mr. Michael Landguth from Raleigh-Durham International Airport. It is great to see you again, sir. There have been a lot of exciting developments and investments of late at RDU, so I think it's very timely to have you before the committee today. I look forward to hearing more about the work you're doing at RDU to make air travel more accessible, safe, and efficient for the folks back home. It is also my sincere hope that this might prove to be an opportunity for others to learn from the great strides that we in the Tar Heel State are making in airport operations and air travel. My colleagues and I on this committee are so thankful you're here and a part of this hearing, Mr. Landguth, and we greatly look forward to your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
With that, Mr. Landguth, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Nels, Ranking Member Cohen, members of the Aviation Subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'm Michael Landguth, President and CEO of the Raleigh-Durham Airport Authority. Let me begin by sincerely thanking Congress for your work on the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2024. Your leadership on regulatory reform and streamlining the environmental review process will make a meaningful difference. For too long, even the most necessary safety-driven airport projects have been delayed by fragmented oversight and inconsistent guidance. RDU is a textbook example. Since identifying the need to replace our primary runway back in 2016, we spent over $30 million on temporary repairs, replacing more than 300 concrete slabs with another $20 million in fixes ahead of completion in 2029. What should have been a priority safety project will take nearly 13 years from initial planning to construction. That's too long. The reforms included in the Reauthorization Act will help RDU and airports nationwide deliver projects faster with greater certainty, and we are grateful for your support. Second, we must prioritize the modernization of critical infrastructure, especially runways. Nationwide, airport infrastructure needs exceed $34 billion annually, far more than the Airport Improvement Program alone can support. That's why tools like the Passenger Facility Charge, or PFC, are so important. The PFC isn't a federal tax, it's a local user fee, approved and used locally to fund projects the community deems essential. Empowering local communities to decide what infrastructure they need and how to fund it is the most accountable and effective way to meet demand and ensure long-term safety. The traveler who pays the PFC is the same person who benefits from safer runways, modern terminals, and improved travel options. It gives communities a direct say in the future of their hometown airports. But there's a challenge. The federal cap on the PFC hasn't been updated in nearly 25 years. Set at $4.50 in 2000, its purchasing power has eroded by more than 50%. Modernizing this outdated cap will give airports like RDU the ability to invest in the infrastructure needed to attract new carriers, expand service, promote competition, and lower fares for travelers. We urge Congress to support that flexibility. Third, we fully support the modernization of our air traffic control system. ATC modernization is essential, not just for safety, but for operational efficiency and long-term system resiliency. Airports are ready partners in this work. Airports across the country have experienced the consequences of misalignment between FAA capital programs and airport planning, which will only increase costs and delays. Strategic coordination and clear communication must be central to delivering a smart, more efficient national airspace system. We are committed to working alongside the FAA and aviation partners to help accelerate this transformation. In closing, I want to emphasize that airports are powerful economic engines. At RDU, we serve one of the fastest growing regions in the country, supporting over 140,000 jobs and generating more than $24 billion in annual economic impact. We're ready to invest, build, and lead, but we need the right tools, flexibility, and coordination to meet today's demands and prepare for tomorrow's growth. I'm reminded of the opening words of the U.S. Constitution, "We the people." It's the powerful reminder that this work is shared and that progress depends on collaboration. While Congress sets the laws, implementation often falls to agencies, where even well-intended policies can become overly complex. That complexity can delay critical infrastructure instead of driving it forward. This moment calls for true partnership, by empowering local communities to decide on what targeted investments they need to make, and by continuing your efforts to streamline regulations, we can ensure the U.S. aviation system remains the safest, most efficient, and most competitive in the world. And again, thank you for your leadership and opportunity to testify today. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I will now recognize a great member of this committee, Representative Massey, who will recognize our next witness. Go ahead, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's my privilege to introduce Larry Krauter, the CEO of the Cincinnati Northern Kentucky International Airport, or CVG. I'm always proud to let people know that the Cincinnati Airport is in Kentucky. A lot of people fly through it and don't even recognize that, but I'm even more excited to announce that the new CEO of the Cincinnati Airport is also going to be located in Kentucky, or has moved to Kentucky. He's only 1 month into his job as CEO at the CVG Airport, but he is no novice. He has 36 years of experience in the aviation industry. His career includes key roles at the Lehigh Northampton Airport Authority in Pennsylvania as interim executive director, deputy executive director, and director of planning and engineering. He also spent the last 14 years as CEO of Spokane Airports in Washington State. At CVG, Mr. Krauter leads a team of more than 450 employees, manages an operating budget exceeding $160 million. He'd probably say that's not enough. Driving an annual economic impact of $9.3 billion for the Cincinnati Northern Kentucky region. I'd also like to point out that this airport is dual purpose. We have the Amazon North American hub and the DHL North American hub there for cargo. His leadership extends beyond CVG. He's a respected figure in the aviation community, serving on the board of Airports Council International North America and past chair of the American Association of Airport Executives, where he received a Distinguished Service Award, and he also received the 2024 Walt Strong Advocacy Award for advancing the federal contract tower program. His expertise and proven track record make him an invaluable player here and voice on aviation policy. By my count, he's been in front of our committee twice before. This will be his third time. The third time is a charm, Mr. Krauter. I'm confident his insights will benefit this committee as we address the future of our nation's airport infrastructure. Thank you, Mr. Krauter, for being here today.
If he keeps coming back, I guess that's good news, huh, Thomas?
That's good news.
Good news. Very impressive. Mr. Krauter, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Representative Massey, for that wonderful introduction. And good morning, Chairman Nels, Vice Chair Weed, Ranking Member Cohen, and members of the Aviation Subcommittee. Just like my colleague, I would like to thank the subcommittee for your outstanding work on the FAA Reauthorization Act, namely taking that important step to raise AIP to $4 billion per year. Also, I want to thank this committee for preserving the $4 billion of AIP funding level included in the continuing resolution. While Congress has certainly stepped up to help, there remains a significant funding gap to solve if we are going to deliver the aviation system that the American people deserve and restore our airports to global prominence. Airports Council International North America estimates the total cost of airport infrastructure needs at approximately $170 billion a year over the next 5 years. FAA estimates $68 billion for those projects eligible for federal funding. And CVG, just one of the 33 medium hub airports in the NIPIAS, has a capital improvement program alone exceeding $1.2 billion in the next 5 years. So to further localize this and build on the testimony you've heard previously, I would like to talk about one of our projects, the Concourse A Passenger Aircraft Parking Rehab project that is our highest priority in our 5-year CIP. The total cost of the project is $90 million, with $67.5 million eligible to be funded with AIP grants. The direction we've seen from the FAA is to phase the project over 4 or 5 years due to the lack of available grant funding, specifically discretionary grant funding. Even with a multi-year phasing plan, the FAA has still indicated that the amount of entitlement and discretionary funds available for this project are only sufficient to fund 60% of the total project cost. This is not an isolated example, and it is occurring throughout the NIPIAS, and we will not succeed if this continues. One potential option to address these shortfalls is through continued supplemental appropriations to help the FAA reach more projects. Yet even with this additional help, Congress would need to more than double AIP to about $9.8 billion annually from the current level to meet estimated need. The committee has preferred to increase financial resources to airports through making supplemental appropriations to AIP as an alternative to increasing the passenger facility charge. So as a starting point for the committee to consider for supplemental funding in the next fiscal year, we recommend $975 million with laddered increases each year over the next 4 years to close that funding gap. A potential source of additional revenue for supplemental AIP funding would be to extend excise taxes to include airline ancillary fees, primarily bag fees. The U.S. DOT Bureau of Statistics estimates airlines collected approximately $8.3 billion in bag fees and cancellation change fees last year. If those revenues were subject to the excise tax, an additional $625 million could have been generated for the Aviation Trust Fund. The PFC remains a key source of funds to help us build America's airports. Over the long period of time that the PFC level has been held steady, its purchasing power has severely declined. This challenge creates more debt that has to be issued by airports across the country to make up the shortfall. At CVG, one of the central components of our terminal modernization program is the $200 million replacement of our baggage handling system, very reliant upon PFC funding. Our team is concerned about the length of time that the approval process is taking with the FAA, and again, asks for streamlining to be applied to all projects that are eligible for terminals, not just projects that are under $25 million per year. What we suggest to complement the existing PFC program is also considering extending the airport terminals program, part of the bipartisan infrastructure law. ATP works well because airports compete for discretionary funding only within the same hub category. We think these resources have been very positive for airports across the country, have allowed them to stretch PFC funds and issue less debt, which we should all applaud. Finally, in the present environment, with the funding levels of AIP unable to close the gap and PFC limits stretched to their very significant extent, as well as the sunset of BIL funding, it is imperative to preserve the tax-exempt status of general airport revenue bonds. In the case of CVG, if our GARBs were taxable, that would divert another $4 million annually from investing in projects to paying additional debt service. I have a number of suggestions that I've made in my written testimony, Mr. Chairman, regarding changes to the FAA and processes, and I look forward to talking further about that with you as time allows. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Krauter. And Mr. Sutton, you're recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Good morning, Chairman Nels, Ranking Member Cohen, Ranking Member Larson, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you very much for holding this hearing on airport infrastructure. I am Andre Sutton, Air Division Director and International Vice President of Transport Workers Union. We represent more than 160,000 transportation workers across the country. We are the largest union in the airline industry for the U.S., representing ramp workers, mechanics, dispatchers, flight attendants, pilot simulator instructors, and others who safely deliver passengers and cargo every day. The TW applauds this committee's efforts to pass the full FAA reauthorization last Congress. Our union strongly endorsed the bill, which included historic provisions the TW spent decades advocating for. However, nearly a year after its enactment, none of the provisions most important to the TW have been fully implemented. We strongly urge this subcommittee to ensure the last year's law is fully implemented to the letter of the law. This will raise the level of safety and return high-quality jobs of our nation's airspace. As a ramp worker myself, I recognize the safety concerns of working on the ramp. 5 workers have died on the ramp since this subcommittee held hearings on ground worker safety in January of 2020. In April 2023, TW member Michael Ingram, an American Airlines ramp worker at Austin Begram, was crushed by a malfunctioning push-out tractor and pinned to a jet bridge. This year so far, a ramp worker has died in Charlotte Douglas and another seriously injured at Chicago O'Hare. These tragedies were the result of a failure of oversight at all levels, including at the FAA. The FAA has not studied ramp worker safety since 2002. Last year's reauthorization mandates the FAA to issue a call to action to review ramp worker safety practices, address longstanding deficiencies in FAA policy, update training programs, and increase the visibility of safety markers. However, the FAA has blown past the November 2024 deadline for initiating this review. As a result, any action will be delayed. Turning to the issue of assaults, last month a gate agent at Washington Dulles was knocked out by a disgruntled passenger. Unruly and violent behavior is traumatizing workers across the industry. This directly impacts recruitment and retention. While the number of formally reported cases of unruly passengers had dropped since its peak in 2021, the numbers still continue to exceed pre-COVID levels. We applaud Congress for taking this matter seriously. The new FAA reauthorization clarified statutory protections to prevent assaults on airport and airline employees. Congress also mandated a task force to develop voluntary standards for combating assaults on the ground and on the plane. Importantly, workers are required to have a voice at the table. Congress reiterated its FAA reauthorization of 2018 requirement for air carriers to develop and institute employee assault prevention and response plans. While a federal no-fly list is the strongest action Congress could take, we have no doubt that the provisions included in the new law will reduce the number of assaults. However, workers will not see any benefits of these changes until these provisions are fully implemented. Lastly, since the late 1980s, the FAA has encouraged airlines to perform maintenance outside of the U.S. by selectively enforcing safety regulations. Today, there are nearly 1,000 FAA-certified repair stations abroad that have been allowed to operate without complying to the minimum standards that the FAA imposes on domestic facilities, including mechanic qualifications, background checks, drug and alcohol testing, and random inspections. China has benefited the most from this lack of enforcement. Last year's law directs the FAA to close all these loopholes immediately. My written testimony includes additional details of importance of properly implementing the FAA bill. The health and safety of TW members and airline workers across the country depend on Congress ensuring that the FAA takes this mandate seriously. Thank you for holding this hearing, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you all for your testimony. We will now turn to questions from the panel. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Krauter, the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2024 made significant changes to the AIP program apportionment formulas. Can you speak how these changes will benefit your airport and airports in general?
Thank you, Chairman Nels, for the question. The new formulas that this committee recommended that were put into the law are very helpful in AIP. Just talking about CVG alone, we will see an increase of over $3.6 million in AIP entitlement coming to us, as well as additional opportunities to compete for discretionary funds. Back to the Concourse A passenger ramp rehabilitation project that is severely short of money. This obviously helps push that in the right direction. And I think overall, $3.6 million looking at a medium hub airport, and how that will also help smaller airports across the country is really critical, because smaller airports even suffer even more than we do in terms of how they have to face projects. And a lot of them are using several years' worth of AIP to literally save up to be able to implement a project at their facilities. So again, this is moving us in the right direction with regard to being able to fund these projects and not have projects take 5-6 years because of phasing impacts.
Got it, thank you. Mr. Landguth, the FAA Reauthorization Act also increased funding for the AIP program to $4 billion annually. Speak of the importance of this increase in funding, how it benefits airports.
Thank you, Chairman. I would tell you one provision of that reauthorization that was really beneficial to our airport was Section 713, which was the PFC turnback. That provided more funding for medium hub airports. It's interesting, I actually had ACI&A do a study that looked over the past 10 years that if RDU had a 450 PFC, how much money would they wind up getting in terms of, as part of the tax into the system, how much money would the citizens of the region actually wind up getting back paying into the system? And they said for every dollar that our citizen pays into the Aviation Trust Fund, we get about 9 cents on the dollar back. It's not a significant amount. So this PFC turnback, what it does, instead of me giving 75% of my entitlements back, it's now at 60%. So it's roughly almost about almost $1 million more a year we'll wind up getting. So that was very beneficial to us to get that turnback back to medium-sized airports. Because I don't think anybody predicted 25 years ago, when with the PFC in place, that it would remain stagnant for such a long period of time. And so trying to get those formulas a little bit more balanced would be important, I think, for Congress to continue to consider.
Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned that, Mr. Krauter, stuff about the passenger facility charge at $450. It's been that way since 2000. You're talking about the shortfalls you're seeing with, I mean, you're talking about 13, possibly 13 years to complete the projects that you have.
Yes, sir.
And just with construction costs, inflation and everything, if you took that $450, what would you make it? What would be the right amount to help you complete your goals and objectives that you see when it comes to capital improvements?
When I last testified before the committee, Mr. Chairman, Representative Massey gave me a homework assignment. That homework assignment was to go back and figure out the exact answer to your question. And at that time, as I was leading a small hub airport, I believe that math was in about the $13 to $14 range for our capital program at that time. And obviously, given the amount of time that's elapsed, that would be considerably more due to construction cost inflation. So you're talking about PFC levels alone that would need to be raised substantially. And that varies from airport to airport. And that was one of the reasons that we had talked about the possibility of uncapping the PFC and allowing airports to figure out exactly your question, which is what do they need to charge in order to efficiently execute their capital program?
Yeah, it is a user fee, obviously. Mr. Landguth, you got anything on that?
Yeah, interesting comment. So interesting. I went back and looked. If we just raised the PFC by $1 back in 2010 to today, it would have produced about $9.27 billion. A dollar. That is a significant amount of money that could be used. I'll give you a good idea. I've got a $1 billion runway that we're building. My entitlement is 1% of the cost of that runway. 1%. So that PFC, removing that cap, so we can afford critical infrastructure like things like runways, because currently under that AIP program, it's nowhere close to be able to support that type of development.
Well, you think about adding a dollar to think that potentially 1 billion passengers in the year 2025. I mean, that's a significant amount of money. We don't know what the CBO score would be on something like that, but that's a whole nother conversation. I will yield. I will now recognize Ranking Member Cohen for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Krauter, you've only been on the job about a month, is that right?
Yes, sir.
Cougars, Bearcats, or Wildcats?
I'm sorry?
Cougars, Wildcats, or Bearcats?
University of Cincinnati Bearcats, University of Kentucky Wildcats, sir.
Good answer, Mr. Massey.
Thank you, sir.
You got a good one there. Mr. Landguth, your airport, no, it was really Mr. Krauter. You weren't at the airport at the time, but Cincinnati got clobbered just like Memphis did when Delta dehubbed. And we had Mr. Anderson before us, who was the president of Delta, and he swore that that wasn't going to happen. Cincinnati wasn't going to be dehubbed. Memphis certainly wasn't going to be dehubbed. He loved the rendezvous, and he loved this guy and that guy and this thing and that thing. It was not going to happen. And then he lied, and we got dehubbed. What happened in the Cincinnati airport? How much of y'all, the Northern Kentucky/Cincinnati airport, how many terminals or how many areas of square footage have y'all lost, or have you redeployed it in some other way since you were dehubbed?
Well, obviously, dehubbing was a considerable shock because the airport was really built around the Hub Connect concept, and we are dealing, as I mentioned in my testimony, with a $200 million plus baggage handling system challenge because the baggage handling system was put in place by Delta, and it was really designed around that connecting passenger and not the origin and destination airport that we've become after the dehubbing occurred. But obviously, we had to make some tough decisions, Mr. Ranking Member. We had to take terminals down that were no longer functional.
You tore them down.
Yes, sir, we did. We had to tear terminals down that were no longer functional. We didn't need that space, and we had to reconfigure the entire land side of the airport, which we've done successfully, but at considerable expense, as you can imagine. The gate areas are a better story than the land side. The gate areas we've been able to utilize as we've diversified our air service. Obviously, we still have additional gates, so we're always welcome to additional air service from our airline partners. But the airport on the air side functions very efficiently, and we do have gate space available. But because of the diversification between ultra-low-cost carriers and regional carriers and major carriers, we've actually really done a good job at utilizing our gate space that's available. So we're comfortable in terms of where we're at from a capacity standpoint now.
Did Delta help at all when you needed to change, or did they not have any responsibilities at that point?
Yes, sir. They did help, and they continue to help. They have been supported our capital improvement program, our bond issuance, the PFC applications, as well as continuing to be the largest carrier in the Cincinnati market at about, I'd say, roughly a 35% market share.
Great. Mr. Sutton, one of the things we did in the reauthorization bill was to make it where people who had mobility problems and had wheelchairs get better standards and rules for their devices. What are the biggest obstacles, in your opinion, are there to the implementation of the new regulations and laws concerning the safe handling of wheelchairs on airplanes?
Thank you, sir. So what we've noticed is that a lot of training or lack of training isn't available to the membership as a whole. We recognize that a lot of these devices, they're not all the same, and they change in various ways. And we were looking at trying to find functional ways outside of training to be able to transition from a ticket counter where individuals may check in, or at the gate area where they may have their wheelchairs or mobility devices, sent down to the ramp area. So we were looking at, are there ways that a lot of the airports today actually have like dumb waiters or elevators, service elevators that are designed for things of that nature, but not all airports have this. So we're looking at other apparatuses that can be utilized on the ramp itself so the employees can then transition, load these devices without damaging or creating any disruptions in the transfer of the passenger going on their journey.
Thank you, sir. To all three of you, has DOGE affected any of your operations? Seen any places where they've cut positions that might affect Raleigh or Cincinnati?
At least for RDU, as of today, as we speak today, haven't seen any impact, especially from an FAA standpoint. But I think a lot of those cuts are going into place. We'll have to monitor that a little bit to see exactly what happens to the different agencies.
And the IIJA, which was passed, how has that affected your airport and your airport?
Yeah, so if you're talking about the BIL dollars that we actually receive, so again, I'll give you an idea. We have a $1 billion runway. 1% of that's going to be paid for out of the entitlement. We've got about 2% discretionary, and those BIL dollars represent about 7%. The total for funding from the federal government to pay for that runway is about 11%. So BIL is a large portion of that overall program. So funding that has been extremely helpful to RDU. But again, you're talking about 11% of an overall larger program we've got. Pretty small investment for a lot of the regulatory requirements that we've got that are placed on the airport.
To your question, Mr. Ranking Member, with regard to DOGE, we have not experienced any adverse impacts. However, we have made a hire onto our staff from one of the FAA employees that was reduced as a part of those activities. So we're very happy to have a well-qualified person join our team. As my colleague, Mr. Landguth, said, we've been very fortunate with BIL, AIG, and ATP funds. We've received over $86 million at CVG And we'll be looking for additional dollars against this terminal modernization program that I mentioned in the last round.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Massey for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you again, Mr. Krauter, for being here today. As we discuss how to fund airport infrastructure, I'd like to focus on the passenger facility charge and its $4.50 cap. It always amazes me, that was set in, what year was that set? When was the last adjustment to that?
2000.
So 2000, it's been a quarter of a century. There's been a little bit of inflation since then, just a smidge. And we have airlines charging $30, $40, $50 to check a bag. And the airport can only charge $4.50 to use the airport. It's kind of amazing to me when you put it in that perspective. I think you said there's $8.3 billion of baggage and claim fees, change fees, sorry. Yet the PFC is still stuck at $4.50. How does that cap impact your ability to fund critical infrastructure projects at CVG, or how did it affect it at Spokane when you worked there?
Thank you for the question, Representative Massey. I think that this is an answer that would apply really to all airports, which is that the current limit really acts as an artificial constraint in terms of particularly how you can pay for your projects either on a pay-as-you-go basis, which because of inflation, that $4.50 is really probably even less than half of what it was set at, being conservative. And that also then forces more airports to basically use the PFC as a debt service mechanism. And that means we've got to issue more debt, and that means we have to obligate the PFC for longer and longer periods of time. You'll find airports out in our system that are literally unable to obligate their PFCs any further because they're out 20, 30 years or more. And I think that is really probably one of the most important points of why the PFC ought to be looked at in terms of an increase or setting it.
Isn't that a feature of the PFC, that you can actually have a guaranteed revenue stream, or as guaranteed as can be, right? You have this revenue stream that you can go borrow money against, whereas when you're getting grants, you don't know that that's going to be there in 4 years or 5 years. And I'm not sure if it was you, Mr. Krauter, or Mr. Landguth, who mentioned that these grants come in tranches and they want to stage things over 4 years or some artificial thing. Was that you, Mr. Krauter?
Yes, it was, Representative Massey. And I think that is just another example that despite the amazing work that this subcommittee did to increase AIP to $4 billion a year, the need is just so significant that you have the FAA coming back and saying, we can't reach that project, even though we know it's a good project. We can't reach it. It's going to take us 4 to 5 years, and even then, we can only fund 60% of that project. And I think that probably is an issue that you would hear from any airport executive that would be providing this testimony to you today.
So when you have to cut it up in stages, it gets more expensive, doesn't it?
It gets more expensive, and it also actually gets less safe. When you can take larger areas out and reconstruct them and not have to break that up in 4 or 5 phases, it's actually safer to do. And so I think there is a safety and efficiency element to this and not just a funding element.
Can you talk about the administrative burdens of applying for AIP grants, and how does that compare to collecting and using PFC funds?
The PFC is, we'll say streamlined to a certain extent, but as Mr. Landguth and I talked about this based on our collective experiences, the streamlining really needs to go to the next level in our opinions, in the sense that FAA tends to try to make everything look like the airport improvement program, and they want to take the same kind of approach to that in terms of getting way down into the details of justification and need. And so it's not uncommon to see an 8 or 9 month process to get a PFC application approved for projects that are very straightforward in terms of their eligibility. And so if we could look at opportunities to streamline, that really would be meaningful to us, and make sure that the FAA does not wander into areas that we believe ought to really be the purview of local decision-making. And I think that's where we find ourselves in conflict at times, is that we want to really retain, and we think we are the best to retain these types of decisions, but we run into a lot of administrative bureaucracy around justification, need, and concerns inside of the way the FAA interprets the AIP program.
Thank you, Mr. Krauter. My time's expired. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Larson for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Sutton, I want to start with you. So we've asked the FAA to do a lot in the 24 reauthorization bill, but we did ask the FAA. We did outline the to-do list for the FAA, and part of that to-do list, you've outlined some of the issues that are of most interest to TWU, your members, and frankly, other folks who work at the airports. And just want to be sure I get, for the record, some of those things. The foreign repair stations, or the heavy maintenance repair stations, the work that we gave the FAA to ensure there's background checks, employee drug alcohol testing, inspections, and so on. Where is the FAA, in your view, on that work list? How much have they done?
Thank you, sir. I don't exactly know exactly where they are. We're still waiting on the one biggest piece, if I can say, is the drug and alcohol testing. If we could just get that piece actually enacted, I think that a lot of these overseas bases or facilities, if they had to follow the same rules that we do here in the States, might reduce the actions that are being pretty much done by the airlines of sending these aircrafts overseas to be repaired on.
Okay, I think Representative Cohen mentioned the baggage handling. Are you getting the direction from the FAA on appropriate, proper training for handling baggage, especially mobility devices?
No, we have not heard anything back, and in fact, there hasn't been a real in-depth study as to some of the guidelines and provisions that need to take place in the work group, and we're hoping to have some kind of meeting and dialogue to establish some of the implementation of the reauthorization bill. And as of yet, we still have nothing to work on, nothing to work with.
And then on the customer-facing airport and airline workers and protecting them from assault, there's a direction we gave the FAA in 2018 and 2024. In your estimation, where is the FAA in the process of helping or establishing the guidelines, just the work plan to deal with the to-do list that we gave the FAA on those issues?
So again, sir, I do not want to be repetitive, but
Be repetitive.
We have nothing. We have nothing to work on, nothing to go with, and every day that passes by, we have frontline employees that go and deal with the company with the passengers directly on behalf of the company. And when things change, which they do in the airline industry, those individuals are the ones that generally are the blunt of the blame, and then they get attacked, either verbally or physically. And we need to establish something that now gives these folks that protection. They need to feel protected at work.
Thanks. Mr. Krauter, good to see you again. Glad you're enjoying your new job. I miss you in Washington State. With regards to the mid-air collision and the FAA's announcement that they've identified 21 airports where there's perhaps a higher risk of mid-air collisions, similar to the tragedy that happened in DCA. What work are the airports generally doing to help the FAA identify as well as change airspace patterns in and around those 21 airports?
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. Great to see you again.
Rick's fine.
Rick, thank you. It's really a collaborative process. Whenever you're talking about making airspace changes, airports and the FAA traditionally do work together very well to make sure that on the airport side, they're looking at community potential impacts as well as how the airfield is used. And so in that collaborative process, which is the best way to operate, obviously, I think that airports and the FAA are both working very diligently to make sure that changes in airspace and the way that Metroplex design in part is done in a way that will continue to allow efficiency and capacity, but safety paramount.
Will there be is there a timeline? Have you received a timeline from the FAA?
No, sir, I'm not aware of one, and I think that points to some of the issues that we've discussed at this hearing. And one of the parts of my testimony with regard to establishing deadlines. I really think that this committee and Congress could really help the system in immeasurable ways by establishing clear deadlines for these types of projects to be completed and conducting aggressive oversight around that.
Thanks. Thank you.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Massey, you wanted to enter something into the
Yeah,
record?
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit for the record an article titled "User Fees Are a Market-Based Way to Enhance Air Traffic Control" by Phil Bell. This article came out a week ago, and it explains why raising the PFC isn't a tax increase. It's more like relieving the airports from price controls. And with that, I ask unanimous consent to submit for the record.
Without objection. Mr. Perry, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, great to see you. One place I believe that the FAA reauthorization bill fell short is in providing air traffic control system reforms that I think are very desperately needed. I've been on the committee for a good while now, and it's the same conversation over and over and over again. Nothing seems to get much better. The recent occurrence of collisions, close calls, and incidents have demonstrated that we need to do something, and it's long past time. Unfortunately, meaningful reform in the last two reauthorizations did not occur. I offered an amendment that transferred the operation of air traffic control services currently provided by the FAA to a separate not-for-profit corporate entity to provide for more efficient operation and improvement of ATC. Now, the provision ultimately failed to be included, but similar proposals in the past have gained widespread support from labor and industry, and the concept has worked where other countries have employed it, most notably NAV Canada. More than 2 decades after Canada switched to a nonprofit corporate model, they have one of the most advanced air navigation systems in the world, and moreover, it costs less. U.S. air traffic control costs about 26% more on average. I don't think there's any silver bullet, but we've got to do something. More fundamentally, the status quo continues to allow our nation's safety regulator, the FAA, to oversee itself. Now, look, you don't have to be a genius to know that that's not a good plan, right? It doesn't follow ICAO recommendations, and when regulators oversee themselves, of course, there's no accountability, and there's usually widespread system failure, which is what we're seeing. It's indicated by near misses, mishaps, those type of things. That's an indicator. I still believe that the path that I offered offers the best solution to a safer, more efficient air traffic control system, but I'm open to other ideas on the topic. I'm wondering, start with you, Mr. Krauter. You have any ideas?
Thank you, Representative Perry, and thank you for your interest in advancing the ATC modernization. It's really, for those of us who've been in the industry a long time, it is frustrating to see efforts that are initiated and then are not followed through upon. And we have seen a number of programs over the time that I have been involved in airport management where the FAA has started off with the greatest of intentions in order to try to make changes to technology and for a variety of different reasons, either being subject to the funding cycle as well as procurement-related challenges have not really been able to ever really finish one of those programs. And so for us, I think it's looking at what is the best vehicle to allow them to get the right technology and procure it and roll it out with a sense of urgency within a time frame that'll actually make a difference.
And certainly the model that we're currently using isn't getting us there, right? Been at this for decades now.
I think
Decades.
I think, sir, that there may be different opinions about what to do, but I think everyone is going to agree with that.
Mr. Landguth,
Yeah,
the minute
maybe.
I have left.
Yes, sir. Maybe you kind of think about what airports are doing across the country. They're looking at P3s, public-private partnerships. New York has done a lot of P3s for developing their terminals. So privatization, maybe there is something there that we should look further. I do think the investment in the infrastructure is going to be important. I will tell you at RDU, right now during the summer, we take portable air conditioning units over to the tower just to keep them to a point where their workers can actually stay in the building. That's how bad it is across the country. So it's not just operating the system, but making the capital investment, and how are we going to collect the fees to pay for that critical infrastructure, I think is an important discussion point.
Well, I got in the 20 seconds remaining for construction and well, generally for construction and maintenance and upgrades, the NEPA process that the FAA follows. Would you comment on efficiencies or lack of efficiencies in that regard?
Since I've got about 8 seconds left, it took us literally 7 years to go through the environmental process for a runway. That's the efficiency you see right now.
I think we get it. Thank you. I yield.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Ms. Davids for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and to our ranking member for holding this hearing today. And thank you to our witnesses for taking the time to share your testimony and experiences with us. I've been a member of this committee since I got to Congress, and consider myself fortunate to have been part of helping to pass the bipartisan infrastructure law, which was the single largest federal investment in our nation's infrastructure in history. And it's been really heartening to see these federal investments be put to use in some of our largest and busiest airports, as well as some of our smaller airports. We've got a ton of small airports across Kansas, and they are often serving largely rural populations. In fact, in cities like Ottawa, Gardner, and then in Miami County, the Airport Improvement Program has invested more than $1 million to help resurface some of those runways to extend their useful life. And I also am the co-chair of the Congressional Sustainable Aviation Caucus and spend a lot of time thinking about our future needs that we really haven't even begun to address, like helping airports adapt the fuel infrastructure for integration of sustainable aviation fuels. I would like to hear from the whole panel if we get to time, but Mr. Krauter, I was hoping you could start by kind of putting a fine point on the importance of both federal investments, the mixture of investments, as, whether it's the AIP or other programs. But I also am curious, you had mentioned the general airport revenue bonds. Could you expand on that as well?
Yes, thank you, Representative Davids, and thank you for meeting with our at our legislative conference a couple weeks ago and addressing us. We really appreciated your input. With regard to the importance of federal funding, most of our airports in the system will continue to need to rely on a significant portion of federal funding. All the airports that you mentioned, in fact, will be largely dependent on federal and/or state funding, potentially through block grant programs, which are also very important that the FAA cooperates with state DOTs on to flow funding primarily to general aviation airports. I would also point out, as you commented, that the bipartisan infrastructure law was truly remarkable legislation in terms of what it was able to do for airports of all sizes. And the fact that the way that the policy was designed, that you compete for discretionary funds within your hub size category was extraordinary. And it really allowed airports to thrive inside of that program, to put facilities in that they otherwise wouldn't be able to afford. And that allowed them to stretch back to the revenue bonds. That allowed them to use that money to defer the need to issue as much debt. And that is very critical because obviously there are limits to how much debt that you can issue.
I'd like to tell a little bit about the RDU story and funding for critical infrastructure. So in 2023, we were probably the fastest growing airport in the country, grew by 22%, grew by another 5% in 24. So we're growing substantially because of what we see in terms of growth in our community. Unfortunately, because federal funding or the PFC cap hasn't been lifted, we're not going to be able to execute on our multi-billion-dollar program. We really need to invest $5 billion. What we can afford is about $2.5 billion, which is building a runway, expanding the landside for a terminal, and building a roadway at the end of the day. That means we will not add any gates, no new gates at RDU for over a 10-year period. During the early morning kickoff, I have no gates. Lunchtime, 5 o'clock. During the peaking characteristics that come through our airport, there's no gates available whatsoever. We only have it during kind of the in-between peak times, what we've got for gates at the end of the day. And we will take on over $1 billion worth of debt. $1 billion worth of debt. So anything we can do to improve and increase the AIP funding and relieve the cap on the PFC, it allows us to accelerate terminal expansion for additional gates, which provide competition and allows us to continue to grow this national airspace system at the end of the day.
Thank you. I see I'm short on time. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. I now recognize. Go ahead, Mr. Mann.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. I represent the Big First District of Kansas, where aviation is a critical industry. In the district, we have roughly 100 general aviation airports, several commercial and regional airports, a huge footprint in aviation and aerospace manufacturing, given our proximity to Wichita. I worked hard to include vital provisions in the FAA Reauthorization Act last year to ensure that the nation's airports can focus on critical infrastructure projects and continue to deliver safe, reliable services. In my view, it's crucial that the FAA and DOT waste no time in implementing the provision that we set forth in that bill. I look forward to hearing from you all today on what Congress can be doing to continue to work for the benefit of everybody. First question, and kind of piggybacking on the last one, but for you, Mr. Landguth, we talked about AIP. What challenges do airports face in really effectively utilizing the program?
Well, I think in terms of using the program, again, give you an idea for RDU, we get about $3.5 million a year worth of entitlement funds. It is a limited number of funds. So our access into the AIP program is pretty limited, usually one project a year. It's not very substantial. A lot of it's going towards the runway itself. So we don't have a lot involved in that program at the end of the day in terms of the process we go through. It's pretty streamlined for us because there's not a lot of grant funding we're actually receiving.
Okay. For you, Mr. Krauter, FAA Reauthorization Act of 2024, of course, contained numerous provisions benefiting airports of every size. I have a lot of rural airports in my district. What can Congress do to ensure that all airports, including our smaller, more rural airports, are given the same opportunities for funding and project assistance?
Thank you, Representative Mann. That's a really difficult question to answer because, again, as you look at how the FAA has to prioritize resources and all the things we talked about in this hearing this morning with regard to the level of need versus the level of resources, a number of these smaller rural airports, despite the fact that they play very important roles in access to the national air transportation system and public safety roles, as we've seen in some of the disasters that have unfolded, a lot of basing is happening for those resources at these smaller airports. The fact is that FAA struggles to reach them with their projects. And on top of that, quite frankly, a lot of the bureaucracy around the grant process and all of the things that come along with it can be very challenging for smaller airports to tackle on their own, especially if they don't receive grants on a regular basis. So I do think that it's a very significant issue. How do we simplify and streamline that AIP process, and can we get that money to get to those lower priorities in the way that the FAA is allocating funds?
And really help our smaller airports get through the process, right? Like that's a big part of it. How do you streamline and make it simpler I agree. The next question for you, again, Mr. Krauter, the Reauthorization Act also contained a title that required the FAA to review its policies and enact regulatory reforms. Have you received any information from the FAA to indicate that they are working to enact this particular title?
Regrettably, the answer is no, sir, we have not. In my testimony, I've spoken at length with regard to the need for us, this committee and Congress, to exercise that kind of oversight, because what has happened, unfortunately, is that when you all have passed a law, and that law can be read plainly by all of us, the FAA will go through a process to interpret that law, and what comes out of that process oftentimes doesn't look anything like what you intended. And so I put some examples in my testimony of that when it comes to dealing with the use of non-aeronautical property, which actually helps airports to raise additional revenue when we can lease or sell that property. The way that the FAA interpreted Section 163 of the 2018 bill, by the time that they went through their process, it didn't reflect really what we believe was congressional intent. And so I pointed out in my testimony, you had to come back again after 2018 and tell them again in 2024, no, this is what we really meant, and this is what we want you to do. So the danger is, do we see that happening again if they go through another finding process or program guidance letter or orders or other internal processes they use that aren't really able to be commented on the same way that a rulemaking would be, or following the Administrative Procedure Act?
I agree, something this committee needs to be taking a look at. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I agree, that's a problem. Mr. Johnson, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member, for organizing this important hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimony. After everything the aviation industry has been through this year, it's easy to forget that airports are more than just places where we catch flights. They're the engines of our economy. In Georgia, thousands of families and small businesses rely on Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta Airport, one of the busiest in the world, to keep the economy moving and to support our communities. However, right now, there's a lot of uncertainty hanging over the industry, thanks to the actions of President Trump and co-president Elon Musk. We are witnessing safety workers getting fired, important grants frozen, and complete disregard for the people who keep our skies safe. This isn't reform, it's a deliberate effort to weaken public institutions so that you can justify turning control of these public institutions after you've starved the beast, turning control over to private interests that care more about profits than safety. It's really frustrating to see this unfold, especially after members of this committee put in so much effort to pass the bipartisan FAA Reauthorization Act. We did our part, and yet it still hasn't been implemented. This law would have given the DOT and FAA the tools to modernize infrastructure, strengthen the aviation workforce, and maintain the gold standard of aviation safety. We already passed the law, and the next step is effectively implementing it to protect our skies, workers, and the economy. Anything less would be a failure to serve the American people. Mr. Krauter, the FAA Reauthorization Act bolstered airport infrastructure by increasing the Airport Improvement Program funding from $3.35 billion to $4 billion. For busy airports like Hartsfield-Jackson International, this funding is essential to moving forward with plans to expand capacity and improve the passenger experience, especially as the number of flights, businesses, and travelers continues to grow. Given the delays in implementing key FAA reauthorization provisions like AIP grants and the current focus on downsizing FAA staff, how will airports be able to continue their much-needed modernization efforts without stable and reliable funding and manpower?
Thank you, Representative Johnson. I think that the issue in the short answer to your question is we won't be able to. And that will have very significant negative economic impacts, significantly potential negative safety impacts and efficiency impacts on very important hub airports like Atlanta, in which communities like Cincinnati and a number of communities around the country depend on in order to access. And I think if you play this out, and I think this is truly a very significant trend that this committee should be interested in, is that the failure to advance these projects with a sense of urgency is going to require, in order to maintain safety, is going to require more and more of the larger airports to become slot-controlled airports and have their capacity capped. And when that happens, you'll see a version of the Hunger Games in terms of who gets access to that limited capacity. And I believe smaller communities are going to be at a greater disadvantage in being able to access airports like Atlanta, as an example, as time goes on, if these projects are not accelerated.
Thank you. Mr. Sutton, in your testimony, you highlighted the ongoing safety risks faced by ramp workers with preventable fatalities and injuries occurring far too frequently. However, this administration's focus on cuts to funding and staffing at key federal agencies, including the FAA, has delayed crucial actions to address these worker safety concerns. Can you discuss the importance of the FAA implementing the mandated call to action safety review of ramp worker safety as outlined in the FAA Reauthorization Act?
Yes, sir, and thank you. So we all know that there are incidents that take place on a large scale, and the two that I had mentioned previously in my testimony could have been avoided. And we're looking for ways to protect the members, the workers that come to these airports. And what our motto basically is at TWU is that we would want the employees to go home in the same way they arrived at work in one piece. And what we're finding is we have took every proper notification to identify, in this case, equipment that isn't functioning correctly or isn't working, or policies that have problems, but yet everything that we have tried to push up goes nowhere. And by the fact that there has not been any kind of ramp safety studies done since 2002 tells us a lot that people are not taking safety seriously enough. I would rather be proactive to find ways to mitigate any kind of circumstance that would cause harm, damage, and in some cases death, if by simply going and outlining, and some of the stuff that we already have it as a tool at our disposal just not being utilized. We need that effort to actually be pushed so people can now formulate ideas and notions that actually work, put them into plans and procedures that actually prevents injuries and save lives. Now you.
Thank you. I appreciate the chair's indulgence, and I yield back.
Absolutely. Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Owens for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Well, let me just start off by saying I thank each one of you guys for the insights you've given us. A very important hearing today. Last year's FAA reauthorization was a rare glimpse of how Congress can function as a bipartisan effort. We were able to deliver advanced aviation safety and efficiencies, workforce development, and innovation in aviation technologies. For Utah, home of Salt Lake City International Airport, these investments provided us support and the continuity needed to prepare for our 2034 Winter Olympics in our growing inland port. I know my colleagues on both sides of the aisle are eager to rekindle the same bipartisanship as we deal with the issues that are being brought to us today. I look forward to this committee addressing the challenges of our country's aging airport infrastructure, proactively preparing for new, emerging, and innovative technology. Mr. Landguth and Ms. Krauter, both advanced air mobility and unmanned aircraft systems will play a role in moving people around during the 2034 Salt Lake City Olympics. What can airports do nationwide to prepare for this integration of these technologies?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. I will tell you, we're already engaging with the FAA to try to figure out what those flight paths would actually be within our community. to get into the airport and out of the airport. We're also trying to figure out as we go through our master planning process, where exactly would we actually put these new aircraft? Where would they wind up landing? How do you transition passengers? So there's an active enrollment between the FAA, the airports, trying to come up with creative solutions as these new technologies come online, provide a new way for customers to travel in and out of our airports.
Mr. Carter, do you want to add to that?
Thank you, Representative Owens. I'm a colleague of Mr. Wyatt's at the Great Salt Lake City International Airport, just salute all the investment that they're making to prepare for the Olympics, but also just to serve as that economic engine in the community. Just as Mr. Landguth mentioned, we are very focused on advanced air mobility. We happen to have the distinction of having 2 cargo hub carriers at Cincinnati, both DHL and Amazon. And you can imagine that those conversations, and they're very interested in how advanced air mobility may be able to more efficiently transfer packages, but obviously people as well. And just as Mr. Landguth said, we have to look at it inside of a regional aviation system plan and look at what are the ranges of these types of aircraft, over what kind of ranges will they be able to operate economically, but even more importantly, how are they going to be able to fly through different types of complex airspace? So back to Mr. Landguth's point, we are working with the FAA to ensure that there are opportunities for us to create those pathways in airspace, make sure we have facilities that are capable of accommodating these types of aircraft. And we expect there will be roles at regional airports as well as general aviation and corporate facilities for advanced air mobility test beds that can fly into and out of complex airspace so that we can build up a reservoir of knowledge on how these aircraft are going to operate safely in the NAS.
Very good, thank you. Mr. Sutton, what improvements can be made in the design and maintenance of airport infrastructures to better attract and retain workforce of tradesmen and other skilled laborers and airport workers? Any ideas, improvements in terms of how to attract or retain a better workforce?
So, sir, I believe the easiest way to probably respond that if people knew that when they applied for a job and they were afforded the opportunity that they were going to a safe environment and that they would not have to worry about attacks or had to worry about verbal abuse or having to deal with anything that would be negative to their hopefully advancing career. I think if we could simplify things enough to identify the issues that are actually staring us in the face, and I speak from safety because that seems to be our biggest concern in the work groups that I represent. And if we can ensure anyone that has an interest in coming on board is going into a safe environment, I think that changes the complexity of things.
Okay, well, thank you, and once again, thanks for your comments. And we will come together as a body to make sure we address this issue. Thanks so much.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Foshee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Cohen for holding this hearing. And of course, thank you all for being here with us today. Again, Mr. Landguth, I am glad that you were able to attend today to speak with us about the issues that RDU Airport and so many others across the country are facing. Thank you for detailing your runway project's long, sordid story. It goes without saying that it shouldn't take 7 years to get environmental approval to rebuild a deteriorating runway. Looking back on your experience, what do you think the FAA and Congress could do differently to move important projects like this ahead more quickly and more cost-effectively?
Thank you, Congressman Foshee. Thank you very much for that question. That's a great question. I will tell you that the thing that continues to stick out for me is the environmental process and the timeliness of going through that environmental process. And I'm going to kind of try to explain kind of in layman's terms. But if you think about the environmental process being kind of 2 phases, the first phase is what I call the preliminary phase. And there's a whole bunch of things that the FAA asks us to do in terms of reports and justification before we even begin the environmental documentation phase of it. And that's kind of what I call the execution phase. So as part of the reauthorization, Section 783, which now established very specific timelines for completing an EIS, that was fantastic. It's great to have a timeline for that phase of the program. But that preliminary phase still doesn't have specific timelines. And this is an area that I think maybe Congress could weigh in a little bit. Let me give you an example. When we started the EIS process, trying to figure out whether or not we were going to do an EA or EIS, back in 2017, the FAA asked us to actually do a white paper on that, come up with a recommendation. Should it be an EA or EIS? Spent months putting that together, lots of money, only to come back and find out that the FAA was not in support of that. We then had to sign a reimbursable agreement to the tune of $500,000 to actually pay for staff to go perform this EA EIS. Further down the line, they asked for further business justification regarding our proposed runway length. Report, study, report, study, report, study, before the clock even begins. And so we finally decided to provide them an alternative, and the alternative was a hybrid model where if we didn't agree on the runway length, maybe we would pay for the 1,500 feet that they didn't agree with, and the 10,000 feet would be eligible. That was denied as well. And we finally got to the point where we said, we need to move forward, and we moved forward in January of 2021. That process took 4 years to just start the clock. So maybe a recommendation as you move forward, that maybe what airports can do, if there's a project already on your approved ALP, which our runway was, simply sending a notice to the FAA, at which point in time they've got 30 days to decide whether or not this is going to be an EA or EIS, so we have some sort of certainty in the beginning portion of this phase to get this project moving in terms of the environmental review process. That's something that I think we learned as a result of this, and something that we think Congress could weigh in on.
Thank you for that. Mr. Sutton, you've highlighted today the on-the-job difficulties that ramp workers face every day. The airport tarmac is undeniably noisy. You battle the elements, including extreme heat in some parts of the country, and you can't exceed the carrier's targeted aircraft turnaround times. We tend to forget that ramp workers play a role in commercial air travel because travelers do not interact with them directly. But the reality is that countless travelers rely on baggage handlers. When you consider the duties they perform in such a noisy, congested environment, we can see that this work can quickly become dangerous. Can you talk to us a little more about the safety concerns you have seen firsthand as a ground worker yourself?
Yes, ma'am, and thank you. So, firsthand knowledge, as a crew chief that used to work on the ramp, the crew, you would get notifications of, say, an aircraft swap or some kind of a change or diversion, and then immediately you have this clock running in your head where you have X amount of time to get the whole process done. Sometimes, because policies and procedures aren't always thought out. Sometimes some of the policies and procedures that are mapped out don't actually match the assignment that you have to do. People tend to cut corners or put themselves at risk by doing things that are not normal. And we would like for some consideration for the process. The operation is the operation, we understand that, but there are things that happen on a day-to-day basis. And the airline industry is time crucial. And a lot of times, trying to do what you normally do, even though there's a change in the operation, does put safety at risk. So we try to look at ways of coming up with policies that actually understand the process when it changes, something that secures at least some form of safety.
Thank you for that, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Gentlelady yields, and I'll recognize Mr. Stauber for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Landguth, you failed to mention the lawsuits in between that can happen. In the Fiscal Responsibility Act, there was a shot clock for an EA 1 year, a shot clock for an EIS 2 years. The prior administration, even though it was signed into law, used that as a court recommendation, unfortunately. There's a shot clock now. That's law. We must follow it. But you give a good example of permitting. We have to change our permitting systems. We have to make it work. I mean, you explained hundreds of thousands of dollars that, in your opinion, was wasted, and I believe that it was wasted. We could do much better. So I do appreciate you talking about permitting reform, and we need it across the nation, and I think we can deliver it in really a bipartisan fashion. Mr. Sutton, I have always said that safety above and below the wings must be top priority. Over the last 32 months, at least 5 ramp worker fatalities have been reported by the media. In the FAA reauthorization of 2024, we included a call to action safety review of ramp worker safety, which requires the FAA to assess safety on the ramp and report to Congress on results and any recommendations for action. When you consider the duties that the ramp workers perform, and you have, it's a noisy, congested environment. You quickly realize that the work can be extremely hazardous. Mr. Sutton, could you speak to us more about why it is so important for the FAA to complete its call to action safety review of ramp worker safety as mandated by Congress in the FAA reauthorization?
Yes, sir, and thank you. The ramp has a lot of known issues that compromises safety on a regular basis. And we can talk to the companies that we work for till we're blue in the face, but we need something that has some bite to it. And the fact that the FAA has not came out and done a ground safety study that would then take in everything that we know is happening on the ramp and in the tarmac, the cargo areas that we work, those would then transform themselves into recommendations and findings that Congress could then come weigh in on and make the decisions that, hey, this is not being followed the correct way, or we need to change the work and the way we do our work today and into a positive manner that puts us back into the realm of safety for everyone involved.
Agreed, thank you. Mr. Krauter, in my district, the Duluth International Airport has the 3rd oldest air traffic control tower in the country. You can imagine the condition it is in. I toured it last summer. I was appalled that the workers had to work in that old 1950s facility. They are one spare part away from having major, major issues. And you know what? We have a fighter wing there, F-16 fighter wing, that we strategically depend on to defend our airspace and our national security. And we look at it, you know this better than anybody. We need to really invest. Yet despite the inadequacies, Duluth provides a critical role in generating local employment by supporting regional aviation activity, joint civil military operations, and all other businesses located in the Northland. Roughly 4,000 jobs. And our airport contributes an estimated $1.4 billion to our local economy. And you mentioned the airport terminals program in your testimony. Duluth has made it clear that the ATP was a lifeline for projects like the Duluth Air Traffic Control Tower. Mr. Krauter, could you elaborate on why this program was successful for airports and what improvements you might suggest to further enhance it?
Thank you, Representative Stauber. And I think that the Duluth story is a story that is being told across a number of communities in our country. And back to my testimony is that we are not delivering right now for the American people with regard to this type of infrastructure. Towers have special challenges. It's not as though you can just site them anywhere. And in the U.S. Contract Tower Association that I've been a part of through AAAE, we have toured a number of these types of towers across the country, and we know that there will be a potential to sweep the AIG funding that is unobligated into the Federal Contract Tower Program. The selection process, however, for towers that would qualify for replacement is another example, I think, of where this committee could ask and practice more oversight on the FAA in terms of their decision-making. I know that in some places the decision-making was also influenced by other factors, such as where was the location of that tower within a census tract of maybe a disadvantaged, part of a city or metropolitan area. And I know that there were other towers that were very deserving, that some of those unfortunately fell just outside of those areas.
Right.
So I think that with regard to how we use Bill ATP types of programs in the future, I would look to that funding of towers around that. If this committee can figure out a way to extend that type of funding, I think towers should be a priority.
Thank you very much. My time is up, and I yield, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields. Ms. Powell, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to all of you. First of all, let me just say that, airport workers, from mechanics to flight attendants to air traffic controllers, certainly work very hard to keep flights on schedule and make sure that everyone arrives safely at their destination. And those workers deserve safety, just like passengers. In February, I met with TSA officers from New Jersey as well as New York and heard about the verbal and sometimes physical attacks that they endure from unruly passengers. They shared that many of the perpetrators of those assaults are never charged. This type of violence is absolutely unacceptable, and I certainly look forward to working with my colleagues on the committee to ensure a safer and better environment for all of our transportation workers. But along those lines, Mr. Sutton, in your testimony, you discussed the abuse that's faced by gate agents as they work to enforce airline policies and support passengers in the case of delays or cancellation. What impact does this type of behavior have on customer-facing airport workers, and does it impact employees' retention?
Yes, Miss, and thank you. Thank you for the question. So a lot of the folks that are, I consider them the frontline employees, they directly deal with the public. Anytime something bad happens at an airline, they're the first ones that are looked at. Generally, they're the customer service agents that now make the changes, rebookings, and all of these things. And a lot of folks today are just very impatient, and sometimes they act out on their emotions. And they do things that maybe in a normal setting they would not. But unfortunately, people are lashing out, and those folks, the frontline employees, are the ones that get the most of it. And it's just not deserving, because they're there to do a job safely. They're there to try to make your travel experience an enjoyable one. But we all know things happen. And I think that if there's a way to solidify ways of protecting the frontline employees from such behavior, and maybe make it, I don't know if this is even possible, but maybe make it a little harder for those individuals that maybe this isn't their first time acting out or being verbal, or in some cases being physical, but we have to make sure and maintain that there's a safe working environment.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to just shift topics for just a sec, real quickly, because I want to make sure that my time doesn't run out. Teterboro Airport, which is in my district, is one of the busiest general aviation airports in the country. How would improvements to the FAA air control technology and staffing impact your members, especially as at the bottleneck in the nation's airspace that frequently experience delays and cancellation? What do you say?
It becomes very challenging because sometimes we don't have control over the environment or the weather. And if there's ways to establish secondary measures that can be invoked when situations arise, I think that's most important. Contingency plans are something that we can fall back on, and hopefully with the proper communications with everyone involved, we can establish some kind of a policy that does work.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I realize that I have a very short time, and perhaps maybe this means you may not be able to give me a full answer, but could you please, Mr. Krauter and Lanfer, what kind of updated airport funding options would give airports and their communities control over how to best address their individuals' needs, especially with respect to competition, traffic, and capacity? We have like less than 10 minutes, sorry.
In brief, uncapping the PFC would accomplish the majority of those objectives.
Thank you. Thank you for that quick response.
With 1 second, I'll echo what Mr. Krauter said. Uncap the PFC allows you to build the infrastructure that can provide that competition for customers.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. I now recognize Mr. Barrett for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our panelists for being here. Mr. Krauter, I'm not sure the airport that you're in charge of, was that the departing aircraft for the life flight back in October that had the fatal accident? There was a air ambulance crew that was tragically killed back in, I think it was in late October of last year. I just had a personal friend of mine was one of the crew members on that, and I know they operated in your area, and I didn't know if they had operated out of your airport or not. But I just wanted to extend my appreciation for all those that had responded to the accident in that particular area. But thank you again for being here. Question I had for the two of you that are here from the airport executive side. So I represent the district in Michigan, includes the Lansing Airport. And as you can imagine, it gets rather cold in Michigan. We get a lot of snow, we get a lot of ice. There's not a lot of great chemical, like you can't just toss some, you can't go to Walmart, get some rock salt, throw it out on the runway. Obviously, we've got a lot of corrosion control measures that we have to be very mindful of when we're dealing with aircraft. You can't drive down the road in Michigan and not see a car with rust over the wheel wells, but we don't want that on our airplanes for very obvious reasons. So a lot of airports are left with mechanical means of removing the snow and ice on the runways. It's my understanding, though, that if an airport purchases a snow removal piece of equipment, they can't use FAA federal funds for the assembly or construction of a garage or a warehouse that would house that. Is that accurate?
Congressman, I can't speak to the specifics of that, whether or not that is eligible or not. But I think anything that Congress can do is provide as much eligibility for those types of things for airports, I think would be a good thing. And really leave that decision-making in terms of, with the limited funding we have from AIP, let that airport director decide where those investments need to actually occur. That gets the best return on the investment for the federal government by giving it in the hands of the airport director.
Okay. Yeah. I don't know, Mr. Krauter, if you have any thoughts on
Yes, I'm surprised at that response from the FAA. It concerns me that there's not common sense being applied to that issue, regardless of where that equipment comes from. It has to be protected to extend the life of the asset so it performs when we need it to perform. So I think, echoing Mr. Landguth's comments, is that this is a great example of the FAA potentially being maybe even inconsistent, but certainly reaching through something to that level of detail where that decision should really inure to the judgment of the airport professional.
Yeah, sure. No, I do appreciate that. It's my understanding, and speaking to my airport executive, is that if they purchase the vehicle themselves using funds that they have available for that, they can't use then federal funds to build the warehouse that it would be housed in, which of course degrades the value of the asset, makes it less reliable and everything else. So I think that's something we ought to be working on. The other question I had for you is we do a lot of cargo at the Lansing Airport, and we're one of the major regional cargo hubs. And is it accurate that cargo, the takeoff and landing cargo-related side of things gets less preference for how we can apply resources to an airport? I know, for example, we have cross runways, and if we have a routine of a lot of cargo, some of it very timely and sensitive, overnight delivery and all those types of things, and we have something that shuts down one of our runways, we need to have a second runway available. And I don't know if that's given proper consideration by the FAA if they're involving cargo flights instead of passenger flights. And I don't know if you can shed any light on that.
Thanks, Mike. First of all, there are some limited financial resources for cargo entitlement funds that airports that have a significant amount of cargo can tap into. But just as the theme of our testimony has been, they're very inadequate to meet the needs. And as you point out, in many cases, cargo aircraft are heavier, and the pavements that are associated with heavier aircraft operations, they either accelerate the deterioration of the life of the pavement, or they need to be built stronger in order to take those types of aircraft. So I think back to your point, Representative Barrett, is that we need, in general, more funding so that we can direct towards cargo. And I think as far as the justification piece that you're talking about with regard to airfield capacity, really one operation, one landing and one takeoff still counts against that total. And so if you look at that runway capacity, like the volume of this water jug, you have a certain amount there, just like we all do, and it doesn't matter how much of that is filled up by cargo or passenger, it all adds up against the total. Obviously, time of day and so forth affects that, but those decisions really need to be made in terms of the cumulative impact of the operations.
Thank you. I appreciate that. My time's running out. I would just tell you that in speaking to pilots that do that, they say that the cargo might be heavier, but it doesn't complain as much. So, thank you.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Ms. Gillen for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses appearing here today. Mr. Sutton, earlier this year, a broad group of aviation stakeholders that included, among others, airports and TWU, wrote Congress a letter with a united message expressing support for ensuring America has safe and resilient and modernized air traffic control system. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter this letter into the record.
Without objection.
So one of the priorities included in the letter is exempting the FAA from government shutdowns. Could you describe the need and importance of that request and why it would be beneficial and indeed critical to exempt the FAA from government shutdowns?
I would like to have members of my staff formulate a response and get that to you, because I don't want to speak out of turn.
Okay. All right, if you would follow up, I would appreciate that. Thank you. Mr. Landguth, you have a major runway project, a major terminal expansion on the horizon at RDU, which are both very important projects for your community. And my district borders not just one, but two major airports, JFK Airport and LaGuardia Airport in New York. Could you tell us a little bit about the economic benefits to regional economies that come from making infrastructure investments at airports?
Yeah, so it's interesting. The North Carolina Department of Transportation, Division of Aviation, does an economic impact study every 2 years. They've recently just completed that study, and they said that RDU has about a $24 billion a year economic impact, produces about $1.3 billion worth of state and local taxes. As we looked at air service recruitment, for example, we recently recruited Lufthansa Airlines for nonstop service to Frankfurt, and we looked over a 25-year period. That one flight coming into the region over a 25-year period was about a $3.3 billion economic impact. But in order to do that, you have to have a runway, and that's what we're working on right now, is building that runway so we can provide that connectivity for people all over the world right from RDU.
Thank you. And to follow up, according to the National League of Cities, tax-exempt bonds have financed more than 3/4 of our nation's infrastructure. And airports often use those bonds to build and renovate their terminals, their parking, and their maintenance facilities and other structures to serve the public, create jobs, and generate revenue. Without access to this cost-efficient option, airports will have to cut back on critical projects to keep flyers and workers safe. And last week, I was proud to join a bipartisan group of my colleagues in sending a letter to the Ways and Means Committee to preserve the federal tax exemption for municipal bonds. Mr. Chairman, I again ask unanimous consent to enter this letter into the record.
Without objection.
So, Mr. Landguth, what impact would revoking tax-exempt status of these bonds have on the aviation industry?
So actually, I thought about this about 5 o'clock in the morning, and I got to be honest with you, I used ChatGPT to do the calculation. But with over $1 billion worth of debt we're going to wind up taking on, if If you look at the tax exempt status, 100, 125 basis points, you run that over a 30-year period, that's probably an additional $200 to $225 million worth of additional cost that's going to go onto a runway. Right now, the federal portion of my runway is about 11%. So we are funding a large portion of this. And so taking away that further aggravates the challenges that we face at RD, which means we're going to build less and less infrastructure as a result of those types of decisions moving forward.
Thank you. One more question. I have about a minute left. So my district on Long Island is right next to JFK International Airport, and one of the biggest issues we face is legacy contamination in our water. Traditional firefighting foams that were used at airports contain toxic PFAS, and those can cause serious health problems, including cancer, liver damage, and immune system disorders. Thankfully, Congress has recently authorized a grant program to help airports transition to PFAS-free foams as quickly as possible to protect the health and safety of our communities. So, Mr. Krauter, can you please speak to the importance of Congress fully funding this program?
Thank you, Representative Gillen. It's very important. The realities of PFAS in groundwater, I think, are going to continue to become better known and understood. It's a very complex issue because of the pathways, and I think there's over something like 9,000 originators of some type of PFAS or PFOA in groundwater. The use of firefighting foam, which of course airports were federally mandated to use, hence I think the importance of Congress stepping in with financial support and regulatory support is very important. And I think that right now, the first step, which was very important, was this transition to fluorine-free foam. And I think that's gone very well across the United States, and the financial assistance is very helpful. I think future phases are going to be more challenging financially in terms of how do we go out and actually figure out how much of what is coming into the groundwater is generated by AFFF legacy use. You also have formerly used defense sites at a lot of airports that actually complicate that as well. And so I think it is something that the industry is going to have to work very closely with Congress to go forward with. And I think the final thing is that because it's a federal issue and because airports were federally mandated to use it, I do think that there are a number of airports across the country that are running into challenges with their state level of environmental protection equivalents and their different interpretations potentially. And so I do think there's an opportunity for Congress to step in and level set that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. I now recognize Ms. King-Hines for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to our guests for making the trek out here to share your experiences and wisdom. I represent the Northern Mariana Islands, a U.S. territory in the Western Pacific that is both geographically isolated and strategically vital to our national security. In the Marianas, our airports aren't just travel hubs, they're critical lifelines. We rely on them for access to healthcare, education, commerce, and disaster relief. But right now, our infrastructure is aging, our runways and terminals haven't seen serious upgrades in decades, and with the collapse of our tourism economy, which is our only industry, the financial viability of even maintaining basic airport operations has been pushed to the brink. The consequences extend beyond our local economy. The Department of Defense is expanding its footprint in the region, particularly on the island of Tinian. But those military activities depend on civilian airports that are under-resourced and in danger of declining further. If we lose the ability to sustain these operations, it won't just hurt our people, it could actually undermine national defense strategy in the Indo-Pacific. And so I'm very grateful for the opportunity to have this conversation and to review the FAA Reauthorization Act to explore critical ways in which we can address some of these issues. I believe we need formulas that go beyond employment numbers and consider economic need, geographic isolation, and strategic importance. We need more flexibility, not just for capital projects, but also to cover operational sustainability, especially in airports where flights have dropped or disappeared altogether. And one of the things that I really appreciate about this conversation this morning is the ability to get insights from industry experts as to how we can make suggestions on how to improve the FAA Reauthorization Act to address some of these challenges. And so this is a question to the airport operators. I just wanted to hear what are your thoughts, or what have you seen in successful strategies that you have seen or would recommend to help smaller or remote airports attract and retain commercial air service so that smaller hubs like this could be self-sustainable? And that's an open question to either of you. And how could the FAA support actually achieving that goal?
Yeah, so talking about air service recruitment, air service recruitment's driven by demand at the end of the day, right? So having the market there to support that, you can put together air service development strategies, you can put incentive programs in place, but ultimately at the end of the day, if the market's not there, it makes it very difficult for the carriers to want to get into that system. I know there's a small grant program, smaller service grant program that the Congress has actually approved and the FAA administers on an annual basis. That's a great tool for that community to actually use and go after those types of opportunities. But success kind of builds on itself, that if you can get that one and continue to grow and then get a population growth, business investment growth, those types of things, that's what's really going to kind of drive overall growth. At RDU, it was a lot about new investments, one of the fastest growing states in the country. Also, lots of people moving into it. When I started 10 years ago, we had 37 different nonstop destinations. Today, we've got 80. It's a really good example is that your market will drive a lot of that growth. You can try to provide some level of subsidy, but that subsidy will have a limited effect if the demand is clearly not there. Now, I will be more than happy, and I think my counterpart Larry would be happy to come to you and visit you out in the
Please
islands
do.
to see that firsthand and see if we can provide some additional recommendations. But it is really market forces that drive that at the end of the day. And so maybe a little investment can kind of nudge those things, but overall, market's got to be there.
I agree.
And I would just add that I think it goes back to this flexibility piece and what is the right place for the FAA to be and not be. And there have been a number of regulatory attempts around air service in terms of how airports can use their funds to provide financial incentives for attracting airline service. And there's some limitations on that in the revenue use policies, as well as some other specific FAA policies. And I think that the majority of airports would like to see the FAA really not involved in those types of decisions, and that they would, again, have more flexibility on how they can use their funds if their top priority is to use their funds in a manner like this. As long as all of the requirements are being met to operate the airport safely, that should be basically the extent to which they're evaluated.
Thank you for that. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Mr. Stanton, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the witnesses for being here today. This is an important hearing. Last Congress, one of our big accomplishments was the reauthorization of the Federal Aviation Administration. And in that, of course, we did prioritize the Airport Improvement Program, building on past investments from the bipartisan infrastructure law, authorizing AIP for a total of $20 billion for the 5-year reauthorization. AIP grants provide essential funding to improve safety, expand capacity, enhance efficiency at airports nationwide, ensuring long-term sustainability for airports and the communities that we serve. I used to be mayor of Phoenix, and so Sky Harbor Airport was in my city, and it is the best-run airport in America. No offense to the other airports represented on today's panel. Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport is no exception. We have utilized AIP smartly. We've grown. Earlier this year, they've received $84.3 million to support the construction of a new 2,100-foot taxiway bridge to accommodate increased aircraft operations, reduce delays, and improve airport efficiency. This is critical infrastructure. The new taxiway will bridge north and south airfields on the west end of the airport, allowing more efficient airfield operations and enhancing the airport's ability to handle increased air traffic, ultimately benefiting passengers, airlines, and businesses throughout the state. That smart investment will allow a 3-runway airport to operate like a 4-runway airport because of more efficient operations. Airports are the hub of growing local economies. Sky Harbor serves over 40 million passengers annually. It's a center of commerce and tourism for Arizona, the most important economic engine in the state of Arizona. More than 47,000 people employed at Sky Harbor. It has a $44.3 billion annual impact to the state, and that number is growing. It's not just people, it's moving thousands of tons of cargo that arrive on the tarmacs every day, goods to be trucked around the state or delivered to homes in the valley. And Sky Harbor connects local communities to the global market, brings in billions of dollars for our community. That is good for our growing economy and sustaining good jobs. That's the fuel that keeps Arizona going and money back in our local economy. Mr. Landguth, you oversee another busy airport in Raleigh-Durham. How has increased investment and formula changes in the AIP impact not only your airport, but your local economy? And do you have a similar story that I just told about Sky Harbor?
Yeah, first of all, I don't know if you know this, but I was actually an intern in Sky Harbor years ago, so very familiar with the airport. Team does a really good job at Phoenix. You should be very proud of what their leadership does day in and day out. In terms of the AIP, again, the item that I love most about the reauthorization was the PFC turnback. That allows a better proportion of dollars that are coming to the medium and large-size sub-airports. If you think about a lot of the growth that's occurring, a lot of your medium-sized sub-airports are the fastest-growing airports in the country. Think about airports like Nashville, airports like Austin. They used to be medium hub, they're now large hub. You see the track that we're taking that will probably be a large hub as well in the not-too-distant future. And so those types of improvements that you can make from an AIP standpoint go a long way to improving a lot of the infrastructure that we have. We will take all those dollars we get with that AIP, and we will put 100% of that towards building a runway that's really near end of life.
The federal government is at its best when we are a great partner to local government, local communities, and the AIP program is a great example of that. We've made some big investments, and they have had some big payoffs. Some of these investments are under attack. One of the first things President Trump did in office was to target grant funding related to sustainability, pausing grants from the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law, putting them under review. This is a big problem. We as Congress have voted on these bills, and the president had signed these bills into law. It's unclear if the administration is targeting all things related to sustainability, things like sustainable aviation fuel, sustainable materials and construction, or simply trying to single out certain grants like electrical vehicle charging. But all of that was voted on by Congress and signed by the president and needs to move forward. Withholding funding or unnecessarily changing the conditions of the funding is unlawful. This is causing confusion for our local and state partners. At Sky Harbor, this could mean a charging and fueling infrastructure grant, of which we awarded $15 million, could be gone. A $10 million grant providing essential roadway safety improvements in infrastructure communities adjacent to Sky Harbor, a very high poverty area that needs these investments and better connecting the downtown businesses. That could also be at risk. And these are investments to connect communities and grow our local economies in Arizona. Mr. Krauter, you're CEO of Cincinnati Northern Kentucky International Airport. How is the local airport a hub for your community? What's at stake if federal investment ends or is significantly cut?
Thank you, Representative Stanton, and we are all big Chad Makovsky fans here, by the way. Does a great job running Phoenix Sky Harbor with his team. With regard to how these types of moves would impact us, obviously any move that is going to remove or otherwise complicate the amount of money that's delivered or the time frame in which that is delivered is definitely a threat to our ability to put that money to work, as Mr. Landguth pointed out, on important capital improvement projects that, as we've talked about, often take years to develop. So with regard to, we have not seen guidance yet on some of these things, and obviously are waiting guidance to come out in order for us to determine what happens next. But I will just point out that we also receive, not just in funds appropriated by Congress from AIP, but we also have been involved in receiving flow-through funds from our Metropolitan Planning Organization around some of the sustainability goals. A lot of that in Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky International, is around electric vehicle charging, and we are proceeding with those projects. Those grants are under contract. And then the other I would just say that I think we're concerned about long-term is sustainable aviation fuel. This is a very important issue for one of our hubbing cargo carriers, DHL, and we're going to really be concerned in terms of what do we see coming out with regard to the delivery of SAF at our facility.
Thank you. I yield back, Chairman.
Mr. Hurd, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Nels and Ranking Member Cohen, for holding this important hearing. Last year, Congress passed the 2024 FAA Reauthorization Act. I was not a part of that. I was not yet a member of Congress, but I am this year a member of the Highways and Transit Subcommittee, and we're going to be looking at surface reauthorization this Congress. One of the issues that's important for people that live in my district, in Colorado's 3rd Congressional District, is the issue of congestion on roadways to airports. And for example, Denver International Airport, which is used by many in Colorado's 3rd Congressional District for flights, has seen an 80% increase in daily traffic from 1995 to 2003. And yet we haven't done a good job of keeping up with the roadway infrastructure in particular. Mr. Landguth, I wanted to ask you, in your testimony, you highlight your experience managing an airport servicing the fast-growing Research Triangle Park. Do you see airports benefiting from better multimodal connections and including improved road capacity and networks to the airport and upgraded interstate interchanges?
Congressman, that is a great question and very timely for RDU, because one of the key projects we have as part of our Vision 2040 and the $2.5 billion investment is just that, making a roadway improvement. You may not be familiar with RDU, but there's a big kind of a loop road. Think about a horseshoe that goes between 2 different terminals. I will tell you, during the holiday period and during the kind of the evening period, we have traffic that backs up all the way back up to what we call Interstate I-40. We're going to make about a $175,000 investment, make lots of improvements in terms of providing additional curb space for our airport, but also trying to improve the flow through that area as well. Also develop what we call a ground transportation center to take some of that activity actually out of that roadway system and put it into a central core to continue to expedite customers in and out of there. We're also talking with our local community. Our local community's got an interest in developing what we call a BRT, bus rapid transit, and finding some way for us to connect out to the interstate directly into RDU. We're looking at things like autonomous vehicles, electric autonomous vehicles that could run that route in there and get people off that interstate and quickly get in without creating any more congestion. So a lot of thought is being put into those types of things for airports across the country. It's an important issue and something that Congress should continue to consider from a funding standpoint. Right now, we're not receiving any funding. We have to make that investment because our customers expect a better level of service.
Mr. Landguth, thank you for that answer. What would result if we don't make those investments in roadway and capacity increases? What would that mean for a busy airport like yours and a busy airport like Denver International Airport?
Probably a phone call from my board of directors wanting an explanation as to why that's the level of service we're providing our customers. It's not acceptable. And so if there isn't funding there, what larger airports can do, and what we are doing is we're taking on long-term debt to fund those types of things. Smaller airports don't have that luxury. They're not generating enough income, and with a cap of $4.50, it restricts them even further. So providing funding for the smaller airports is important. For larger airports, we're going to make those investments. Hopefully we can get funding, but if not, it's got to be done. It's not the level of experience we want our customers to have when they come to RDU or any airport across this country.
Great. It's bad for airports. I hear that. Mr. Krauter, question for you. Before I came to Congress, I was proud to serve my community as vice chair of the Grand Junction Regional Air Service Alliance, where I worked with our airport to improve air service availability in our region in western Colorado. When it comes to planning and developing airport infrastructure projects, how can we encourage collaboration between airports and local governments and community stakeholders? What are some best practices that you've seen in your experience?
Thank you, Representative Hurd. And I think this also goes back to some extent about your earlier question with regard to roadways. And I do think one of the issues that we see is that there are some silos out there in federal agencies and federal programs in transportation. And I think that there are opportunities for us to maybe look at things in a more collective manner and maybe look at blending funds in order to achieve some of these multimodal objectives. And I've served on the boards of many metropolitan planning organizations in my career, and I've watched that struggle of trying to figure out what what funding mechanism can we use to try to either improve access to an airport, or is there ways that the community could use funds and flex those funds into something that may benefit the airport either directly or indirectly? And I think a lot of it has to do with structure. And so I hope that the committee will look at structure in terms of providing that kind of flexibility. I would also say that I've been involved in a number of projects around airports in my career where we have had to go back and make surface transportation improvements for runway safety. As an example, by rerouting roads around the runway protection zone, as I've done in a couple of airports. And that does require that kind of cooperation between the community and the airport, and then also that approach to using flexible local funds. So again, flexibility, local decisions.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Garcia, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, the witnesses here today for this very important hearing. In the FAA bill that we passed last Congress, it requires a review of airport ramp worker safety. This review would serve as the basis for improving safety protocols, including updated training materials for ramp workers and supervisors alike. Ramp workers operate in a noisy, quick-paced environment. They direct and service aircraft and ensure our belongings make it from point A to point B. Ramp workers play a crucial role in air travel, but the job is a dangerous one. At least 5 ramp workers have been killed, as has been noted here, since 2023. And earlier this year, a ramp worker at O'Hare was critically injured after being pinned underneath a tug vehicle. Despite this, the FAA has been slow to conduct its safety review. Mr. Sutton, as a ground worker with experience, your perspective is invaluable. Can you tell us about the safety concerns that you've witnessed firsthand?
Yes, sir, and thank you. So again, we recognize things in our work group, in our work areas, that we have tried to push up to a higher level to get recognition that there's truly an issue. And thus far, we have had no confirmation of any ramp worker safety studies that are going to be conducted by the FAA. There's no interaction with the FAA to go and take what we have been touting as an issue forward. There's just no resolution to some of the day-to-day problems, but we try to manage and minimize as much as we can, but the issues still are there. They're still present. We just need something that has a little bit of teeth as far as legislation or a policy or a procedure that actually protects the workers in their work environment.
Thank you for that. Although it wasn't included in the final FAA, my Good Jobs for Good Airports Act bill would have provided minimum wage workers and benefits for airport service workers, including ramp workers. Airport workers, many of whom are Latino, African American, work long hours for poverty pay to keep our airports running, and they deserve better. Mr. Sutton, can you speak to how bolstering airport worker wages and labor protections can benefit airports as a whole?
Yes, sir. So to make the job more attractable, to get more and more people to come to us for employment, wages are crucial because we're living in a time where a lot of people can't afford a lot of things, and we have to protect wages at all costs. And by doing so, it attracts some of the best and some of the brightest. And in some cases, you touched on it earlier, these airports are a crucial part of communities, and they serve a purpose. And if someone can get a job at say a major airline, and the airport is, say, 20 minutes away, versus someone that may have to travel 2 hours away, economically, it makes it more conducive. So protecting the wages is extremely important any way that we can, and trying to get as much safety protocols to not only protect you with wages, but once you're there making your decision to do this job, you have protections that's going to protect your health and safety while you're at work.
Very well. Thank you, Mr. Sutton. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. McDowell. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for testifying before the subcommittee today. Mr. Landguth, it's always good to see another North Carolinian up here, and so I appreciate you joining us. Airside capital projects, and can you describe the process by which the PFC is approved by the FAA? What changes were made in the FAA Reauthorization Act, and why you do or do not feel that those changes were productive?
Okay, great question. It starts kind of with filling out kind of a pre-application with the FAA, trying to kind of sell your project and trying to get their approval on that project. A little bit of a lengthy kind of going back and forth. Then you fill out an actual application, define what the costs are going to be. It's a pretty, I would say, lengthy process that we wind up going through for a PFC application. I might have what I consider to be kind of a counter to that in terms of maybe there's a different way for us to do this at the end of the day. And maybe a different way to do this is, why don't we put the people in charge of this process? And the way we do this is the airport would simply submit to the FAA a notice of intent that says, these are the projects, these are the associated values. As long as it sits on some sort of approved list, which is runways, taxiways, those types of things, then all the FAA's role would wind up being in this new model, would simply be putting it in the Federal Register to allow the general public to understand what would be out there. Then let's turn it back to the airport operator to engage the public in this conversation, to have a public forum, to allow not only the airlines to come in as part of their consultation with us, to publicly address their concerns that they have with the PFC, let the public come forward and express those concerns, and let the governing body in the local community make the decision and take a public vote on that particular matter. And if they take the public vote and the public says, this is something we want, the public has made that decision, we then simply have to turn back to the FAA and say, this is what the people want, this is what we want to implement. So I think that the streamlining process that I've laid out is a much better process that could actually be put into play to improve the overall process from a PFC standpoint and put it in the hands of the citizens that are the ones that are actually paying the fee in the first place.
Thank you. In your testimony, you provide an account of the significant challenges that RDU, which is an airport that gets me to and from Washington safely quite a bit, but RDU's encountered with replacing the airport's main runway, many of which have had to do with the length of time that is associated with completing an environmental assessment for the project. Can you briefly quantify those costs of those delays for the subcommittee?
I have not quantified them from a monetary standpoint, but I can tell you from a time standpoint, 7-year period to this point to actually get to that. I will tell you that in parallel, when we reached out to the FAA in 2016, we told them that our current runway, our 10,000-foot runway that supports all of our transatlantic service and all of our West Coast service was really reaching kind of end of life. And if we didn't do something quickly, we were going to have to get into a very expensive maintenance repair program. Right now, what we do is we do a night closure. So once my transatlantic service takes off, we get in and saw cut out a 25 by 25 slab. We shore it up, report, let it cure. That aircraft goes across the Atlantic Ocean, drops customers off, picks it up, and then comes back 19 hours later and lands on that runway. We've had to do that 300 times. The cost is $100,000 per slab. We spent $30 million. We're going to spend another $20 million. We're going to spend $50 million. So the delay of just maintaining the infrastructure is going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of between $50 and $70 million, which is not reimbursable under the AIP program. Regarding the additional cost for the consultants, I'll be more than happy to get our team to put together an estimate. But really, it's been trying to maintain that runway to keep us alive and not lose all the service that we have gained over a short period of time.
With the remainder of my time, I would just like to point out that that is astounding, that an environmental assessment would do that kind of harm to what you're trying to do. So I appreciate you being here today, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Carvajal for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this important briefing, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I want to bring attention to an issue that has been detrimental to U.S. airports, PFAS contamination. For decades, the FAA required that U.S. airports use these harmful chemicals in their firefighting foams, and airports have done so in good faith to keep the traveling public safe. In the FAA reauthorization bill, which passed overwhelmingly with bipartisan support, we authorized funding to help airports transition from these outdated foams to newer, safer, fluorine-free foams, or F3. Now we need to ensure those funds are appropriated. I am proud to serve as a Democratic lead on a bipartisan letter with my colleague, Congressman Mike Lawler, urging the House Appropriations Committee to allocate $100 million for this transition. I hope many of my colleagues here on this committee will consider signing on to this bipartisan letter to fund the provision we on the Transportation Committee authorized in the FAA bill. Mr. Landguth, I worked with Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Larson, and my colleagues across the aisle to include the PFAS Airport Transition Program in the FAA reauthorization bill signed into law. As I mentioned earlier, I am fighting to ensure this program gets funded at the necessary levels to protect our community's public health. In the interim, can you discuss what the FAA is doing now to help airports in their transition to these new foams?
Yeah, so I will tell you that this PFAS issue is a very, very complicated issue. We do appreciate the legislation, the funding for trying to deal with the AFFF and find a replacement solution. The FAA has put out a guidance document about the replacement type material you can use. But I think Congress needs to recognize that the regulatory framework for environmental cleanup is still very murky at this point in time in terms of what disposal standards look like, treatment standards look like, who can handle, how you deal with that. All those things are not very clear. So while we appreciate it, making the transition to a new type of foam, the disposal of this and handling this material has still not been solved at a national level or even a state level, and it creates tremendous concern for airports. I used to work in the environmental business, and we'd always talk about cradle to grave. I've got to get that product to an end result that can be regulatory approved, not something in the future, but before I put it there, to ensure that I can clearly get it in that location in a safe manner, and I don't have any long-term liability. We don't have any assurances at this point in time. So we appreciate the funding, but it is a very complex issue that is still developing as we speak.
When you say developing, could you elaborate a little bit more? I mean, we know the complexity, we know it's a problem.
Sure.
The funds are there, but what steps are being taken?
So again, right now, EPA is identified as a hazardous substance, but we don't have treatment standards that are out there. We don't have disposal standards that are out there. The changing of this material is not kept pace with the changing from an environmental standpoint of what those regulations are for disposal and cleanup at the end of the day. That's the challenge.
Thank you. Mr. Landguth, my home state of California is home to 29 airports, which have created and sustained 1.6 million jobs and generated $230 billion in total economic output. According to the Airport Council International, North America's latest infrastructure needs survey, U.S. airports face $174 billion in infrastructure needs over the next 5 years, with California alone accounting for $24 billion of that total. I know that you touched on this in your testimony, but can you please elaborate on what we, as members of Congress, can do to help bridge the funding gap? And will the $4 billion in federal funding through the Airport Improvement Program recently enacted by Congress help, or are there other sources of revenue that we need to consider?
So great. So let's do the fun math here, right? So $174 million over 5 years translates into $34 billion a year of what your airports told you you actually need to build this critical infrastructure on an annual basis. The AIP program is $4 billion. That's a $30 billion shortfall. So what you're asking airports across the country to do is use their bonding capacity to pay for all this infrastructure, and that's got a limited lifespan until you get to the point where you kind of get bonded out, unless you're willing to continue to raise rates. So what can Congress do? I think you've got a great tool out there. It's called the passenger facility charge. As I remarked before, a dollar increase in 2010 to today would have produced about $9.27 billion. So a little bit of increase over a long period of time produces a tremendous amount of income that can be used for critical projects like a runway at RDU.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm out of time, but I do have one last question that I'm going to submit for the record for Mr. Sutton. If I could get an answer in the future, I would appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Gentleman yields, and I recognize Mr. Under for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Mr. Landguth, I was reading, and listening to your testimony and reading your written testimony about the saga of the 5 left, 2-3 right runway at RDU. The primary runway delayed by over 7 years. I think Representative McDowell asked you whether you had a number as to how much that cost. It didn't have an exact number.
Yeah, so from a fiscal standpoint, to maintain the current runway, current investment's over $30 million. By the time we get the runway complete in 2029, just to maintain, it's going to be $50 to $70 million. This doesn't include all of the additional reports that the
So it's not, I'm sorry, I misunderstood.
Yes, sir.
It's not completed yet.
Oh, no, sir.
2029?
2029, yes, sir.
Okay.
We're under construction right now as we speak, as fast as we can.
So, as I understand your testimony, one of the delays was the FAA requiring an environmental impact statement rather than an environmental assessment. Can you explain the difference between those two and why the impact takes so long?
Yeah. So in layman's term, an EIS, environmental impact statement, is actually run and developed by the FAA. If they feel like there's a higher level of potential environmental impact or public scrutiny on a particular project, they may drive it towards an EIS. We had gone back and suggested, after looking at all the evidence, because we were building inside the current fence line, it made sense that an EA was the right way to go, only to find out that after we provided that, they said, no, we want to go with an EIS. And 4 years later, they reverse course and say, just kidding, we're going to go ahead and do an EA.
Oh, they went back to the EA. Okay,
Back to the EA,
that's
and we
what
actually
I
completed
didn't understand. There's already a runway 5 left, 2-3 right.
There is.
It's in the airport environment. It's, as you say, within the fence line.
Correct.
It's a big slab of concrete.
All we're doing is we're going to make a runway 500 feet, 550 feet from its current location.
Way parallel.
That then allows us to reconvert the existing runway into a taxiway, which then allows us to get into a gate program. Without moving that runway, you can't get into a gate program, and you're looking at a multi-billion-dollar new terminal that would have to be built. It's the most cost-effective way to get additional gate capacity, but you have to move that runway first. And the current runway was built in 1985. It's truly at end of life.
Right. And there are, of course, environmental impacts to doing a project this big, but the runway's already there.
Yes.
Runway's
still going to be
obviously, airplanes landing and departing, fuels are being burned, birds are being struck, we hope not, but, okay. It's just mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling that the FAA would delay the project that dramatically. Yeah. What reforms can Congress do to fix this? I know you, in your testimony, you said, consider the recent FAA Reauthorization Act, which includes language on alternative project delivery. Quote, the administrator approves the application using criteria established by the administrator. What can we do to fix this?
Yeah, so what I highlighted for you a little bit is sometimes when a law is actually get passed, a lot of times what you do is you might write something that, well, the administrator will figure that out.
Right.
And when you do those types of things, what the administrator is going to do, and they're trying to do the right thing, is they're going to go develop guidance documents. So
Right.
they are going to interpret and develop that how they thought Congress wanted to put that together, and typically that becomes a very long process at the end of the day. So if they can be as specific as you possibly can each time you pass legislation, then what it does is the administration has got to follow the letter of the law and doesn't provide them the opportunity to kind of expand and add additional requirements that may not have been the intent of Congress.
Right. Sort of a Chevron problem. You mentioned that, the passenger facility charge, PFC, has been capped at $450 since 2000. You argued that modernizing it would help airports like RDU fund critical infrastructure. I can't think of many things other than maybe the Medicare fee schedule. I'm a physician that have done that have stayed steady since 2000. How would raising the PFC impact air travelers, and what could those additional funds be used for?
So again, for us, it would be used for things like a runway.
Right.
I mean, if you look at the AIP formula and the criteria, runways typically are number one in terms of overall funding.
Okay.
But if you look at the overall contribution we're going to see from the federal government, my entitlement's about 1%, my discretionary is about 2%, 3% is coming out of that program at the end of the day. So that PFC does provide us lots of capability. A $1 increase to me translates into over $8 million a year times 20 years. That's $160 million for a dollar. For a dollar.
Okay.
So a dollar will go a long way to help pay for critical infrastructure at the end of the day.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize a great member of this committee, Ms. Scholten.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses for coming here today. This is such an important hearing. We know that airport infrastructure across the country is critically underfunded. The funding that we have been able to authorize and get out to these regions has also been jeopardized by some of the recent changes from the current administration and under DOGE. Now, I have been outspoken since the beginning that we absolutely need to be spending our critical taxpayer dollars with discretion. We need to exercise fiscal responsibility, but the way in which this has been rolled out through DOGE has caused grave uncertainty. Funding that had been promised but then rolled back has threatened aviation projects across the country. Last month, more than $16 million in TSA federal funds were held up for a terminal enhancement project at GRR, that's the airport in my district, due to a Trump administration's executive order entitled Implementing the President's DOGE Cost Efficiency Initiatives. These federal funds were on hold indefinitely and could have risked up to 55 jobs in West Michigan, as well as incurred hundreds of thousands of dollars in additional project management and mobilization costs. This does not sound particularly efficient or fiscally responsible to me. Fortunately, my team and I were able to take quick action and advocate for the release of this funding, and GRR is proceeding on time with this critical project. But we don't know what would have happened if I had not intervened. While these TSA dollars are outside of this committee's jurisdiction, the story holds and illustrates how the Trump administration's chaos can harm infrastructure projects across the country. Mr. Landguth, can you please speak to how the uncertainty of indefinite pauses in federal funds could end up costing airport authorities and federal government more money at the end of the day?
Yes, that's a great question. Actually, we just approved our budget. Our board asked the exact same question as, what about the uncertainty? How many grants or how many dollars do we have from an uncertainty standpoint? There's about $12 million as part of that BIL and that terminal program. We're not sure if that comes forward or not. There's also the bill that deals with BIL for entitlement formula. That's probably another $25 million that we've got at risk. So we don't know at this point, somewhere in the neighborhood, $40 or $50 million that we're not sure we're going to wind up getting it. I will tell you, our size airport and the critical projects we have, we can't afford to stop. If I don't build a runway, I'll lose my current runway. And as I kind of joke with people, the only difference between me and a mall manager is a runway. I have to have a runway.
Yeah.
And so we have to move forward with that project. That means that we're going to have to underwrite that, take on greater risk. And I think that has a lot to do with maybe considering, look at the investment that the federal government's making in some of these larger projects at airports, and look at the balance between the regulatory requirement we're asked to do versus what we're investing. So right now, 94% of that runway is paid for by RDU. The remaining balance is paid for by the federal government. So a 6% interest with all the regulatory requirements that we've got put on top of us, seems like there's something that Congress should look at about better equity there in terms of the investments versus the requirements that have been placed on airports.
Yeah, well said. sticking with you just for 1 second, in your testimony, you highlighted the need for air traffic control reform. This is a huge priority for me as well, including air traffic control facility investments and relocations. As my colleagues on this subcommittee are well aware, modernizing and relocating GRR's 60-year-old air traffic control tower has been a top priority for me, not only to boost traveler and air traffic control safety, but to ensure that the growth that we have seen in this region can continue. Can you elaborate on how airport authorities and the FAA can work together to improve ATC facilities, as well as how Congress can encourage collaboration and expediency of both?
Yeah, it was interesting. I recently read a publication or an article. It's called "User Fees Are a Market-Based Way to Enhance Air Traffic Control." And I thought it was very interesting. Does this provide us an opportunity, a very unique opportunity? It's interesting, the Secretary of Transportation was recently before a legislative conference talking to airports about this very idea. You need to help us try to get innovative, to come up with financing solutions and advocating to Congress for those solutions. Does this provide us an opportunity to take the PFC and not only uncap it for the infrastructure we need, but maybe there's a small portion that could be used for on-site ATC facilities, because you heard what I've testified about, my current air traffic control tower and its current condition. You've heard from other members as well as their current condition. Maybe there is some sort of innovative solution here that we need to explore deeper, that maybe that could be a way of funding some portion of this ATC modernization. But airports are all in. Airports recognize that ATC infrastructure is extremely important for us to be successful and for us to be able to continue to grow and provide the services our community wants, which is continuing to travel. So maybe something for the committee to at least consider.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields. I now recognize Mr. Knott for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To the witnesses here, it's great to see you all, some for the first time, some for the second time in a few weeks. I'm a proud North Carolinian, and I fly in and out of RDU just about every week, sir, so it's an honor to have you here. And when we met earlier this month, candidly, one of your comments to me about the delayed runway construction and the project is one of the paramount examples of bureaucratic inefficiency, and one of those examples that just reeks of everything that's wrong with bureaucratic overreach. And I just want to go through some of the process again. It's been roughly a decade since this project began, is that correct? Around 2016.
Yeah, so we began with a meeting in March of 2016 where we presented to the FAA the current condition of the runway, and we asked at that time for the ability to accelerate the environmental process to try to get that environmental review completed so we could get in construction.
And at that point, was the FAA willing to engage in an expedited fashion or no?
I think after I look at the timeline that it took us to get from point A to point B, I think it took us a long time, and I think we're asked to do things that, for example, we were asked to do an analysis of whether it should be an EA or EIS. We spent months putting that document together, paying for money to do that, and then on top of that, FAA simply made a decision, well, we're going to do an EIS. Right. We talked about the forecast. We developed a forecast. When we develop a forecast, we're talking to the CEOs for the airlines, we're talking to their planning team. That's who we're talking to. So when we put a forecast together, it's because of firsthand knowledge of what we think that carrier is going to do in our market.
Right.
And we got into an argument about the forecast. That took more time.
And this delay, just so
Yes,
I'm clear, that obviously affects your operational capacity, correct?
We were able to keep we were able to keep the runway open.
Yep.
But it took a huge effort by the team RDU to do overnight slab replacements to keep that
I'm
moving
getting there.
forward. Yes, sir.
But if you had been able to operate on an expedited basis within the same footprint, within the same fence line,
Yes, sir.
The airport would be operational in terms of a more efficient way, correct?
Well, think about this. As we came through and came out of the pandemic, everything went up significantly.
Yep.
If on 2016 we would have gotten an expedited process, gotten through an EA in 12 months, we would have been in construction. That construction would have probably been done before the pandemic.
Right.
We would have not seen these significant cost increase.
Gone up 2x.
Yes, sir. Because of lack of contractors, lack of supplies, supply disruptions, all those things just made this even more significant from
All the
an
while,
impact
it's
standpoint.
forcing you to carve out and replace the existing runway, which is not as safe as the alternative. Is that correct?
I would say from a safety standpoint, we're going to make sure that every airplane can get on that ground safely.
I understand that, but it's not the optimal solution. Is that correct?
That is not the right way to run an airport, I'll tell you that. But it's what we had to do to keep that runway alive, because again, to lose all your trans-Atlantic service, all your West Coast service, that is a huge financial hit to our community and wasn't acceptable.
Well, let me ask you this. I'm running out of time. Are you out of the bureaucratic maze that you have found yourself in over the last 9 years?
Yeah, I think we have a record of decision. We're under construction, and now we're just putting people to work, putting lots of people to work to build that runway as fast as we possibly can. So I think we've kind of cleared that hurdle. But, you know, if you kind of, hindsight's always 20/20, right?
Yep.
The advice I would give you is why you've established a deadline of once you issue what they call a notice of intent to begin the environmental process.
Yep.
There's lots of things the FAA is asking you to do prior to that. There is no schedule for that whatsoever. And one of the things they were trying to determine was, do you do an EA or EIS? We probably spent 2 years on that issue alone. Why don't we, if we simply sent a notice of intent to the FAA and say, this is a project on the ALP, that you've already approved the ALP, why don't you go ahead and determine in 30 days it's an EA or EIS? That would have saved years just by doing that.
And costs.
And cost.
And when you think about lost dollars to the community, RDU is an economic engine for the whole state. And slowing this project down for almost a decade, it's innumerable in terms of the dollars that we have lost. Again, when you look at this example, there's very little consistency, obviously. There's very little oversight. I assume you tried to exercise every lever of recourse that you had. There was no consideration for cost. There's no consideration for the delay. There's certainly no consideration for the local economy. I mean, I've seen a dirt patch for years at RDU, and it's just been absolutely stalled. It's a disturbing example, sir, of the federal government largesse that we don't have an answer to yet, or an answer for yet. And I hope that we can work after this meeting to really get into the weeds and figure out how we can prevent this type of costly delay in the future. And again, I thank you for coming up here and bringing the light to this important issue.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Ms. Holmes Norton.
Thank you, Chairman Nels and Ranking Member Cohen, for holding this important hearing. Multiple aviation groups, including air traffic controllers and pilots, have spoken with me about the critical need to upgrade our nation's airport infrastructure. The increasing number of near misses, flight delays, ground stops, and cancellations illustrate the need to upgrade our airport infrastructure. Mr. Landguth, please explain why the current passenger facility charge revenue is insufficient to meet airport infrastructure needs and what steps Congress should take to establish more long-term funding.
Thank you for the question. Yes, if you think over 20 years ago, we put a PFC in place to pay for our Terminal 2. That PFC at $4.50, 100% of that is obligated until 2032. I don't have any additional capacity whatsoever. So that means everything else that we wind up doing with the limited AIP funding that medium-sized hub airports actually get, if you don't have PFC capacity, that means you're going to have to bond it out. And so we're going to go bond out over $1 billion worth of debt for our size airport, which is a lot of debt, and that makes it very challenging. It means projects will be deferred. It means you won't do a gate expansion to provide additional gates for a very growing community, one of the fastest growing communities in the country. That won't be available to you. We have a critical bridge we're trying to get across from our parking garage into the terminal itself to prevent customers from having to go across a walkway that cars drive across. We won't be able to do that project either. So it's had significant impacts in terms of our ability to be able to continue to grow and meet the demand of our community by not having the ability to have additional fees. And again, as part of my testimony, I will continue to try to advocate for the citizens. Let's put this decision back in the citizens' hands. Let's ask them the question. If I ask the individuals in my community, you want to pay $1 more for a runway? I think they unequivocally would say yes. That is important. You want expansion of your terminal? Yes. Let's give it in the hands of those individuals, and at the local level, let that be approved at the local level for the PFC. I think you'll find out the citizens are willing to pay more for the level of service that they expect and level of service they want, and they can see their dollar. When they pay $4.50, they see it when they go through my terminal every single day.
As co-chair of the Congressional Quiet Skies Caucus, I'm focused on combating aviation noise, particularly for airport-adjacent communities like the District of Columbia, which I represent. Mr. Krauter, in your testimony, you mentioned issues with the FAA approving updated noise exposure maps for your airport. This data is essential for reducing airport noise. What can Congress do to expedite this process?
Thank you, Representative Holmes-Norton, for that question. Back to a common theme that we're discussing in this hearing is establishing deadlines. We submitted entered into the conversation and submitted our updates, and it's been over 14 months since we've had that submission, and they're still not approved. So I think that, again, the common theme that we hope that this committee hears and pursues is the importance of establishing clear deadlines so that once a noise exposure map and a noise compatibility program are submitted, there is a certain number of days deadline for the FAA to take action. I think that has proven to be very helpful to the FAA and very helpful to airports and the communities that we serve.
Mr. Sutton, in your testimony, you discussed aircraft being serviced outside the United States, where there are often weaker safety standards. I strongly supported provisions in last year's FAA reauthorization bill mandating stronger safety requirements for aircraft serviced outside the United States. Has the FAA been implementing these policies, and how can Congress ensure compliance?
Thank you. To this date, there's nothing being actually implemented. That seems to be our concern. We got language, good language in the bill that affords us the opportunity, but again, nothing's being enacted upon. So it appears to be status quo when it comes to the work being done in facilities other than in the U.S., but being given the liberties to perform these job functions without the same scrutiny that we have here in the United States.
I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. I now recognize Mr. DeSaulnier for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I love your tie. We're friends. I want to ask you a somewhat different question about the overall, your business plans, both cash flow, given the current international economy. I represent a district just east of San Francisco. It's crucial for goods movement. So first on the cargo side, we're seeing some pretty dramatic changes, not just at the ports, but throughout the goods movement chain. So cargo flights, but also on the commercial side on the West Coast. So we saw this shift over the last 2 decades from the Atlantic to the Pacific being more similar in terms of both commercial, but particularly goods. So when I drive to the airport, I go across the Bay Bridge and I can see the number of ships waiting to offload at the Port of Oakland, which is the 4th busiest port in the United States, Long Beach and LA being the 2nd. Huge impacts right now because of the tariffs and just our relationship with the Pacific Rim. We have some adjustments to make, but I wonder in terms of your planning, maybe start with Mr. Krauter and also for the workforce, how do you plan for an environment from a near-term cash flow basis for your airport, both on the commercial side, given that it looks like we're going to drop pretty significantly, particularly on the Pacific Rim, and then for cargo, it's something that we don't talk a lot about, but seems like there's a pretty dramatic change in how long that will last. So the consequences of this aggressive policy by the administration to the reality of what's happening on the ground, where there may be things, there are things that we could agree on that we need to adjust in our relationship with China and Vietnam and other countries. But the things that I don't think have been really thought through in terms of the damages we may be incurring to your operations or to the workforce.
Thank you, Representative Desaulnier. I think that your observations are very important as it relates to how airports need to run like businesses and not utilities. And that's really an important shift that has occurred over time. And part of that is because of our challenge with resources. And so for us, my initial thought as you were asking your question was how are we responding? And the truth of that is to make sure that we have the best possible reserve situation that we can and the best possible cash on hand situation that we can. A majority of airports are challenged to keep certain amount of days of cash on hand relative to bond indenture requirements and credit rating and so forth. But the reality is that will help us be able to adjust depending on what occurs, as I think what we're seeing is that the cargo carriers are going to have to basically, and others are basically in the process of reconfiguring their supply chains. And what we don't know is, will that actually move some types of goods, to your point of observation of the ships sitting in the harbor and looking at that, will it get to a point where that moves some of these goods to air shipment? And so there could be some potential ways that our air cargo partners reconfigure their supply chains to continue to be profitable. But from our perspective, that I think is the issue, is planning for the that type of variableness and uncertainty. The best way that we can do that is by maintaining strong balance sheets.
But the predictability is important, obviously. Mr. Sutton, as far as the workforce goes, and I'm thinking about the totalitarian, what am I trying to say? The system across shipping, cargo, air cargo, and rail taking it out into the rest of the country in areas like ours. So how do you schedule people? Are you worried about the fact that you're going to have job loss, or it's just unpredictable?
Well, a lot of what you asked, the work groups that we represent, we're merely a byproduct, meaning this, that through conversation and dialogue with some of the structure that is changing, we try to do the best we can to accommodate. Now, we have language that gives us some protections from, say, job losses, if you will, but only to a certain point. So we can only do our part in the whole scheme of things, but I feel that communications with all parties involved, because it does and it will affect everyone eventually. And we can only do what we can do from the scale in which we work.
Perfect timing. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields. Are there any further questions from any members of the subcommittee who have not been recognized? Seeing none, that concludes our hearing for today. I'd like to thank you. I thought this was a great hearing today. The subcommittee stands adjourned.